Every day you lie to yourself, and you don't even suspect it. Your mind is a virtuoso of self-deception, working around the clock. It rewrites memories, distorts facts, and passes off convenient lies as truth. You think you make rational decisions? In reality, your brain first feels and then constructs clever justifications so you believe in your own logic. In 1957, psychologist Leon Festinger discovered something shocking. Students who lied for $1 actually believed their own lie. Their mind imperceptibly rewrote reality to avoid discomfort. This is not a bug. It's a feature of your consciousness. You live in an illusion that you yourself created. And the scariest part, you don't know where the truth ends and self-deception begins. Are you ready to look in the mirror? Then get comfortable and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Let's begin. Part 1. The Laboratory of Self-Deception. In 1957, psychologist Leon Festinger made a discovery that would fundamentally reshape the field of psychology. His initial intention wasn't to upend the discipline. He merely sought to observe how individuals react when their core beliefs are challenged by conflicting evidence. What he uncovered was both profound and deeply unsettling. Festinger identified a psychological phenomenon he would later term cognitive dissonance, a concept that revealed a disturbing aspect of human thought. Our minds are remarkably intolerant of contradiction. Instead of confronting opposing information objectively and reconsidering our assumptions, we often distort reality to preserve a sense of internal harmony. The experiment that led to this insight was deceptively simple, but incredibly revealing. Festinger enlisted college students and instructed them to perform a series of mind-numbing tasks for an hour. These included monotonous actions like rotating wooden pegs slightly and repeatedly transferring spools from one tray to another. The exercises were intentionally designed to be tedious and devoid of meaning. At the end of the experiment, participants almost unanimously described the experience as painfully dull. But then came a pivotal twist, one that would become a landmark moment in psychological research. Some students were asked to convince the next participant that the tasks had actually been enjoyable and interesting. To incentivize this deception, half were paid $20, a decent sum at the time. The other half were given just $1. Both groups successfully delivered the lie. Yet it was what happened afterward that unveiled the intricate workings of the human mind. When asked later to honestly assess the experience, the results diverged dramatically. Those who received $20 maintained their original view. The experiment was boring. Their dishonesty had a clear rationale. The generous payment justified the lie. But the students paid only $1 showed a striking shift in perception. They began to report that the tasks weren't as bad as they first seemed. Some even claimed they had been somewhat enjoyable. Take a moment to appreciate the magnitude of this finding. These were intelligent, thoughtful individuals. They had just endured an hour of repetitive, pointless activity and initially recognized it for what it was. But when their self-image as honest people clashed with the reality of lying for a trivial reward, their mind stepped in to reconcile the discomfort. They altered their own memories and perceptions to believe the falsehood they had told. This wasn't an intentional lie, nor an effort to protect their reputations. These students genuinely believed their new version of events. Their brains had rewritten the story so subtly that they didn't even notice the edit. The illusion was so seamless that even the magician, their own mind, was unaware a trick had been performed. This is the heart of cognitive dissonance, the brain's quiet but powerful ability to reshape reality in the name of psychological comfort. What Festinger exposed was a sobering truth about human cognition. Contrary to the idea that we are logical beings occasionally prone to mistakes, he revealed that we are inherently irrational creatures who have learned to cloak that irrationality in reason. The mind is not naturally inclined to pursue truth. It seeks relief from mental discomfort. And when truth threatens our sense of comfort, it is comfort that usually wins. Worse still, this internal manipulation happens entirely beneath our awareness. Further research would later broaden the implications of Festinger's work. One especially revealing case involved a religious group that firmly believed the world would end on a certain date. When that day passed without any catastrophe, the group didn't abandon its beliefs. Instead, they concluded that their unwavering faith had prevented the apocalypse. In their minds, the failed prophecy had become a triumphant vindication. This represents cognitive dissonance at its most dramatic, where objective failure is reinterpreted as success. Yet perhaps the most disturbing revelations came decades later, thanks to advancements in neuroscience. Brain imaging technology has allowed researchers to observe what occurs in the brain during episodes of cognitive dissonance. The findings are startling. Areas of the brain involved in analytical thinking begin to deactivate, while regions responsible for emotion become increasingly active. Paradoxically, it is during the moments when clear-headed thinking is most critical that our ability to reason begins to shut down. Scientists have watched this transformation unfold in real time, witnessing how our logical faculties diminish while emotional reactions take control. You can actually observe the exact point at which rationality surrenders to emotion. When people are confronted with information that challenges their deeply held beliefs, their ability to think logically all but vanishes. At that moment, emotion takes the reins entirely. The mind halts any serious critical evaluation. We aren't engaging in true reasoning. Instead, we feel first and then build elaborate justifications after the fact to support what we already want to believe. This is why facts so rarely change minds. It's also why confronting someone with evidence can sometimes make their mistaken beliefs even stronger. And it helps explain why even the most intelligent individuals can cling to ideas that are clearly untrue. Their intellect isn't serving the pursuit of truth. It's being enlisted to protect emotional impulses. In many cases, the smarter they are, the more skilled they become at fooling themselves. This insight carries serious implications across all areas of life. It shapes our personal relationships, the careers we pursue, the ideologies we align with, and the ethical frameworks we adopt. We like to think of ourselves as rational creatures, but that image is largely a facade. At our core, we are emotional beings, wrapped in the convincing illusion of logic. Perhaps the most disturbing part is that we don't even realize we're wearing a mask. It's constructed so seamlessly that even we, its creators, fail to see through it. Part 2. The mind's hidden arsenal of self-deception. Deep within your consciousness lies a hidden set of psychological tools, far more intricate and elusive than anything in a magician's toolbox. These mental devices have no official names, no manuals, and no clear guidelines. Yet they're constantly at work, silently influencing how you perceive reality without your awareness. In the language of psychology, they're known as defense mechanisms, but this term doesn't begin to capture their true power. These mechanisms are not just clinical abstractions. They are the unseen architects of your internal world. They construct your subjective version of reality, revise your personal narrative, and shield your identity from psychological threats. Operating in the background, they continuously alter your perceptions, often without your conscious permission. Among the most complex and pervasive of these is rationalization. Rationalization functions as your mind's personal spin doctor. Its role is to reinterpret your thoughts, feelings, and actions, no matter how ethically questionable, into a version of events that portrays you in a favorable light. The truth becomes secondary to the comfort of a convincing narrative. What matters is preserving your sense of integrity and moral coherence. Rationalization can take even the most troubling behavior and dress it in the appearance of reason or righteousness. Consider a student who resorts to cheating on an exam. The reality is simple. They weren't prepared and chose to break the rules for a better grade. But almost immediately, rationalization kicks in. The cheating is reframed. Everyone else is doing it. The instructor is unfair. The test is poorly designed. Or they've worked hard all semester and deserve a break. This internal storytelling mechanism can produce endless explanations, each more credible than the last. What makes rationalization especially deceptive is that it doesn't feel like a lie. The student truly believes the story they've constructed. Their mind has rearranged the facts to create a version of events that feels ethical and justifiable. The act of cheating fades into the background, replaced by a new narrative that feels entirely legitimate. The brilliance of this illusion lies in its self-convincing nature. The deceived and the deceiver are one and the same. Yet rationalization is just one tool in a vast psychological toolkit. Another, even more covert, is projection. This mechanism works by transferring your own unacceptable feelings, impulses, or traits onto others. Instead of facing uncomfortable truths about yourself, you see them reflected in those around you. Projection turns your internal conflict into an external accusation. Take, for instance, someone who harbors racist beliefs. Rather than acknowledging these within themselves, they might become convinced that others are the ones being prejudiced. A partner contemplating infidelity may grow irrationally suspicious of their significant other's loyalty. A corrupt official might loudly accuse others of dishonesty while overlooking their own. Projection doesn't just disguise inner turmoil. It recruits the outside world to support a distorted self-image. This process isn't random. It's precise and selective. It targets particular people, attributing to them exactly what's needed to maintain your psychological equilibrium. A man who struggles with anger might see aggression in everyone around him. A woman feeling intellectually insecure might perceive others as patronizing or arrogant. In essence, projection transforms the external world into a warped mirror, one that reflects everything except the parts of yourself you refuse to acknowledge. Reality becomes a filtered version of your internal world, where your suppressed traits are projected onto others as if they originated there. Then there is denial, a mechanism with a different function but equal psychological force. While rationalization reshapes the narrative and projection shifts blame outward, denial simply erases the threat. It acts like a mental eraser, eliminating uncomfortable truths before they can take hold. Think of someone battling alcoholism who insists they're in control, even when their life shows clear signs of collapse. Or a person drowning in debt who continues to spend as if their finances are stable. Or a spouse who ignores glaring evidence of betrayal. Denial doesn't reinterpret or reassign reality, it obliterates it. In the mind entrenched in denial, the troubling truth never existed at all. What's astonishing is how convincing this illusion can be, especially in the short term. These psychological tools weren't designed to make us better people, or even to make us happy. They exist for a more primitive reason: to maintain our mental balance when faced with truths too painful or disruptive to fully absorb. In small doses, defense mechanisms serve as essential psychological safeguards. They help protect us from emotional distress and traumatic experiences that might otherwise compromise our ability to function day to day. A touch of rationalization can soften the blow of our mistakes, allowing us to move forward without being paralyzed by guilt. A bit of denial can make it easier to cope with the awareness of our mortality. A limited amount of projection may help maintain self-esteem in a world that often chips away at it. Yet, as with any powerful tool, these mechanisms can become dangerous when overused. What begins as a temporary coping method can gradually transform into a habitual lens through which reality is distorted. A person who relies too often on rationalization might lose the ability to face their actions truthfully, becoming entangled in a pattern of justifications that blocks meaningful growth. When projection becomes a recurring response, it can lead to a skewed worldview where perceived threats are everywhere and trust is scarce. Over time, this mindset breeds suspicion and erodes relationships. Similarly, habitual denial creates an increasingly warped perception of reality, allowing problems to fester unchecked until they erupt into significant crises. What makes these defenses particularly insidious is not just their individual power, but the way they reinforce one another. Rationalization can lend credibility to denial, masking evasion as logical reasoning. In turn, projection fuels rationalization by pointing to imagined external causes for internal issues. Denial then steps in to conceal the workings of projection, keeping us blind to our own misdirection. Together, they form a complex network of self-deception, gradually insulating the mind from honest self-reflection. The more we depend on them, the more indispensable they seem to become. Over time, a person's entire worldview can become rooted in elaborate self-created narratives. Perhaps the most troubling part is that most of us aren't even aware we're using these defenses. They operate beneath the surface, shaping our understanding of the world before we're even conscious of it. By the time a thought emerges, it has already been molded to fit our beliefs and self-image. We don't first observe reality and then interpret it. Instead, we absorb an interpretation and accept it as reality. Eventually, these mental filters become so ingrained that we can no longer distinguish between accurate perception and psychological distortion. This blurring of truth and illusion makes self-awareness rare, and deep personal transformation even rarer. The irony is that the very tools we would need to uncover our inner workings are the same ones that obscure them. It's a psychological catch-22, like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror or attempting to pull yourself upward by your own shoelaces. These mechanisms are not malfunctions in the human psyche. They are essential features. They function precisely as intended, operating silently and automatically at the core of how our minds manage the world. Part 3. The Theater of False Choices. Jean-Paul Sartre uncovered a striking truth about human behavior, one that many other philosophers failed to grasp. Amid the chaos of wartime Paris, he watched ordinary individuals navigate extraordinary circumstances and came to a profound conclusion. The most insidious lies we tell aren't about our actions, but about the actions we pretend were never possible. Sartre named this form of self-deception bad faith. Bad faith is not a simple lie we tell ourselves. It is a complex, deeply rooted distortion of our own potential. It involves denying the full scope of what we could have done. Sartre's insight came from a radical idea at the heart of his philosophy. Human beings possess absolute freedom. This isn't freedom in the political or societal sense. It is an existential reality. At every point in time, through our decisions and actions, we are constantly forging our own identity. Every moment of your life, you are choosing, shaping your character, defining your path. Even when you're surrounded by overwhelming external pressures, how you respond to them remains up to you. When culture or community demands obedience, the choice to conform or resist still belongs to you. Sartre went so far as to say that even under threat of death, the ability to choose remains intact. This freedom is all-encompassing. It cannot be avoided, and for many, it is a deeply unsettling realization. The instinctive reaction is often to retreat from it. Bad faith is the elaborate psychological armor we construct to shield ourselves from the anxiety this freedom brings. It convinces us that we had no choice, that we were trapped, when, in truth, we were not. It's the internal voice that tells you nothing can change, that you're anchored to your job, your habits, your relationship, your situation. It presents itself as the safer path, but it is, in fact, a prison of your own making, crafted from fear and disguised as prudence. What makes bad faith so perilous is its ability to mimic wisdom. It often wears the disguise of maturity, responsibility, or practicality. It cloaks avoidance in the language of caution and wraps fear in the appearance of sound judgment. Sartre illustrated this with a simple yet revealing image: a waiter in a cafe. Watch closely, he suggested, and you'll see that the waiter isn't just completing tasks. He's embodying the role of a waiter. His movements are too deliberate, his gestures rehearsed. The smile seems automatic, the mannerisms exaggerated. His whole demeanor becomes a performance. In fully stepping into this identity, the individual persuades themselves that being a waiter defines their entire existence. Their humanity is reduced to a role, confined to a script. In choosing the security of that limitation, they forfeit the openness of their potential. And this, Sartre argued, is a behavior we all engage in. often without even being aware of it. Think of the mother who insists she had no real choice but to sacrifice her dreams for her children, or the office worker who views their job as a life sentence, bound by financial needs and real-world concerns, or the partner who stays in a destructive relationship, convinced that leaving would be too selfish, too disruptive, too impractical. In every one of these examples, what were once authentic options are reframed as unchangeable necessities. This is the essence of bad faith, the subtle shift from freedom to fatalism, from possibility to duty. It's such a smooth, convincing transformation that even the person living within it rarely sees it for what it is. The mother may earnestly believe that no other life was viable. The employee may feel truly stuck. The spouse may fully believe that staying is the only responsible path. Sartre, however, would challenge each of these beliefs. He would argue that these individuals are not confronting the truth of their existence. They are not mere objects being acted upon. They are subjects pretending to be powerless. They are creators of meaning who have convinced themselves that they are victims of circumstance. In every expression of bad faith, this dynamic is at play, the conversion of choice into inevitability. This illusion takes many forms. Sometimes it's blunt denial. Someone insists they can't do something, when in fact, they simply refuse to face the consequences. Other times, it's a distortion of reality. The obstacles are real, but not insurmountable, yet they're inflated until they seem impossible to overcome. Often, bad faith is supported by appeals to external authority. People claim their actions are dictated by cultural expectations, religious doctrines, family pressure. They hand over their agency to these forces, not because they truly must, but because doing so relieves them of the burden of making and owning a decision. But the objective is always the same: to dodge the anxiety of freedom by clinging to something outside the self. Sartre insists that regardless of how persuasive the story may be, or how justified it might appear, we remain the authors of our lives. We choose, even when we pretend not to. Imagine a young woman on her first date, a scenario famously described by Sartre. Her companion compliments her looks, but she chooses to hear it as praise for her mind or character. When he gently reaches for her hand, she neither accepts it nor withdraws. Instead, her hand remains still, as though it no longer belongs to her or responds to her will. She treats her hand as if it were an inanimate object, disconnected from her agency. In doing so, she attempts to avoid the emotional significance of the moment, behaving as though no choice is necessary. Yet in trying to avoid making a decision, she has already made one. By choosing uncertainty over clarity, she postpones commitment and dodges the weight of responsibility. This is the essence of what Sartre calls bad faith. Even in our efforts to escape our freedom, we are exercising it. The act of denying our freedom is itself a freely chosen act. To insist we are powerless is, paradoxically, to assert our power. When we declare ourselves helpless, we are choosing that narrative. Our freedom cannot be undone, no matter how deeply we attempt to hide it from ourselves. At most, we can mask it. We cannot erase it. And that self-deception becomes yet another conscious choice in the continuous unfolding of our lives. But why would anyone willingly deceive themselves about something so fundamental? Because real freedom is deeply unsettling. True freedom comes with unfiltered responsibility for every deed, every shortcoming, every triumph, and every potential future. To claim your freedom is to accept that you alone are responsible for what you do and for who you become. To fully embrace this freedom is to abandon the comfort of blame. You can no longer point to your past, your upbringing, your genetics, your society, or your flaws as excuses. Instead, you must face the fact that each moment demands a moral response. Every decision doesn't just shape your actions, it reveals your identity. This immense burden of radical responsibility is more than many are willing to carry. It is far simpler to believe that life happens to you, that you're a leaf carried by the wind, rather than admit that every moment is shaped by your choices. It's easier to imagine you're following a script written by someone else than to acknowledge that you're both author and actor. Bad faith offers a seductive escape from the paralyzing weight of absolute freedom. It seduces us with the illusion that responsibility lies elsewhere, with other people, external forces, or fate. But the price of that illusion is steep. It costs you your humanity. In rejecting your freedom, you abandon the core of what makes you a self-aware, autonomous being. You cease to be a creator of meaning and become a passive object, a spectator in your own life. You give up the chance to live truthfully in exchange for the comfort of a predefined role. What makes this even more tragic is that this surrender is never necessary. The freedom you try to suppress cannot be erased. The responsibility you flee from cannot be reassigned. Bad faith doesn't eliminate your freedom. It only conceals it. It doesn't relieve you of your duty. It merely dulls your recognition of it. You are still making the choices that shape your existence, even if you've convinced yourself that someone else is making them for you. Part 4. Facts as Interpretations. Friedrich Nietzsche delivered one of the most penetrating critiques of human certainty ever articulated. Writing at the close of the 19th century, this radical German philosopher turned a critical eye toward the confident claims made by science, religion, and moral philosophy. Where others saw timeless truths, Nietzsche uncovered something else entirely: perspective. What many regarded as factual, he viewed as interpretive. What seemed objective, he understood as shaped by subjective forces. Concepts long accepted as universal principles, in Nietzsche's view, were actually the products of cultural conditioning, judgments mistaken for eternal truths. His bold assertion that there are no facts, only interpretations, was not a denial of truth, but an audacious probe into its complex and shifting nature. Rather than embracing nihilism or moral chaos, Nietzsche was advancing a revolutionary idea. Truth does not exist in a vacuum. It is intimately tied to the beings who search for it. In Nietzsche's framework, a fact is never simply raw data, untouched and unbiased. Every so-called fact is molded by the consciousness interpreting it, consciousness that is itself shaped by instinct, desire, fear, and limitation. Human perception is always filtered through biology, our nervous systems, our evolutionary history, and our emotional needs. All these elements color the way we receive and make sense of the world. Thought cannot be divorced from context. It emerges from particular cultures, takes form in specific environments, and is influenced by individual histories. Belief is never born in isolation. There is no purely neutral vantage point, no view from nowhere from which ultimate objectivity can be attained. Our understanding is always mediated, and interpretation is unavoidable. Who we are and what we value directly inform what we think we know. Even something as seemingly self-evident as color perception demonstrates this truth. You see a rose and identify it as red. It feels like a straightforward observation. But Nietzsche would challenge that sense of certainty. The rose contains no intrinsic redness. It reflects light at particular wavelengths, which your visual system interprets. Your brain receives signals from your eyes and constructs the sensation you name red. Now consider how differently other creatures perceive the same rose. A bee sees ultraviolet patterns invisible to us. A dog, with its limited color vision, sees only variations in brightness and hue. A bat doesn't process light at all. It perceives through sound. So which perception reveals the true nature of the rose? Nietzsche's answer: none of them is final. Or rather, all of them are valid interpretations. The idea of an unfiltered, observer-independent rose is meaningless. What we call truth arises from the dynamic between the perceiver and the perceived. This principle extends far beyond sensory experience. It reaches into the deepest structures of science, morality, politics, and art. Every scientific conclusion, ethical belief, political doctrine, or aesthetic judgment originates from a distinct psychological and cultural standpoint. Science, though often presented as purely objective and detached, is built upon human priorities. Scientists decide which questions to ask, what methods to employ, and which findings to value, all based on human needs and frameworks. Take the periodic table. It is not a perfect mirror of reality, but a conceptual tool crafted to satisfy curiosity and facilitate manipulation of the physical world. It's a powerful construct, yes, but not a final revelation of ultimate truth. Moral systems showcase perspectivism even more clearly. Each society creates ethical codes suited to its circumstances. In Sparta, valor and sacrifice were exalted. In Renaissance Italy, prudence and financial skill were virtues. In medieval Christian Europe, humility and piety were held highest. These moral frameworks served their respective cultures well, but none can claim universal supremacy. What is honored in one era or region may be dismissed or even condemned in another. Every moral code reflects its time, place, and priorities. Nietzsche named this insight perspectivism. He saw in this recognition both thrilling freedom and deep discomfort. On one hand, it liberates individuals from the grip of dogmatic authorities, those who claim to possess the one true doctrine or moral order. If no truth is absolute, then no worldview can rightfully dominate all others. On the other hand, it leaves us without the comforting certainty that some fixed standard governs all things. In a world of interpretations, no single perspective reigns. Each point of view becomes part of a continuous conversation, never a definitive verdict that silences others. This fosters a climate where imagination can thrive, risks can be taken, and new ways of understanding and valuing life can emerge. Still, perspectivism brings with it a profound discomfort. It dismantles the reassuring illusion of certainty that many people depend on. If what we consider to be facts are simply interpretations, how can we distinguish between better and worse ways of living? When every viewpoint is inherently limited and shaped by context, how can we decide which ones deserve our allegiance? Without the anchor of objective truth, what prevents us from sliding into unchecked relativism, where nothing holds meaning and everything is permissible? Nietzsche wrestled with these tensions throughout his life, and even he never arrived at answers that fully satisfied him. He suggested that we evaluate perspectives based on whether they affirm or undermine life. Yet, he acknowledged that this criterion itself depends on a particular value judgment, the belief that life is inherently worth affirming. The psychological ramifications of perspectivism are extensive. Most people live as though their perception of the world is simply the way things are. They mistake their subjective outlook for objective reality. When faced with differing perspectives, they often assume those who disagree are ignorant, irrational, or deceptive. The notion that many legitimate interpretations could coexist feels either implausible or deeply destabilizing. Perspectivism disrupts this comforting certainty by revealing that everyone operates within the constraints of their unique standpoint. This doesn't mean all viewpoints are equally valid or equally useful. Some interpretations encompass more information, exhibit greater internal coherence, yield more accurate predictions, or serve practical goals more effectively. Yet none of these traits confer absolute or universal truth. Their value is contingent on the aims and circumstances in which they're applied. A scientific framework might offer reliable predictions and drive technological innovation, making it more useful in certain domains than a religious system that provides meaning and moral guidance. At the same time, that religious framework may address existential needs that science is unequipped to meet. Neither perspective holds privileged access to a final or ultimate truth, perhaps because such a truth does not exist. What we have instead is a spectrum of interpretations, each with varying degrees of applicability depending on the context. This plurality of internally consistent yet fundamentally different viewpoints lies at the heart of Nietzsche's concept of the death of God, the decline of absolute values that once provided a foundation for human thought and culture. One of the most disquieting implications of perspectivism concerns our understanding of the self. If everything is interpretation, then even the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, our identities, motives, and character, are just that. Narratives shaped by perspective, not reflections of any objective essence. What you think you know about yourself, including why you behave the way you do, is filtered through a particular lens, not grounded in any permanent or intrinsic truth. This insight offers both immense freedom and unsettling ambiguity. If your current self-conception is only one among many possible interpretations, then you hold the power to reinvent yourself in entirely new ways. But this also means that the feeling of a stable, enduring identity may be nothing more than an illusion. You might not be a unified self at all, but rather a loose collection of perspectives orbiting around a physical body and a shared memory bank. In the end, the notion of a true self may have no definitive answer, only the shifting stories we construct and that others construct about us in an effort to explain the patterns in our thoughts, feelings, and actions. Part 5. The Grand Illusion. In the ancient temples of India and the secluded meditation halls of Tibet, a remarkable vision of human existence emerged, one so profound that it makes even the most advanced Western psychological frameworks appear shallow in comparison. Rooted in Buddhist philosophy, this worldview offers a deep and uncompromising analysis of the human condition, so comprehensive and so unsettling that it challenges nearly every assumption you have ever made about yourself and about reality itself. This tradition does not simply suggest that you are wrong about certain aspects of life. It declares that the entire structure of your understanding is fundamentally misguided. What you take to be reality is not reality at all. It is an elaborate, persuasive illusion. The self you believe yourself to be is not a solid, enduring identity, but a sequence of shifting processes, lacking any true center. And what you pursue as happiness is often nothing more than suffering in disguise, momentarily eased by passing sensations of pleasure. Perhaps the most disturbing revelation is this: you are not just ensnared by the illusion, you are the one creating it. You are its builder, its sustainer, and its most devoted believer. The Buddhist idea of Maya paints an extraordinary portrait of human self-deception, one far more radical than any theory found in Western psychology. Though often translated as illusion, Maya is not a passive misunderstanding. It is an active construction. Maya is not like mistaking a movie for real life. It is like living inside a virtual reality simulation that you are continuously programming yourself through your desires, fears, memories, and expectations. In every waking moment, your mind is generating a version of reality, not to mirror the world as it truly is, but to protect and reinforce your emotional and psychological patterns. You are not discovering the world. You are inventing it, and what you invent is a reality meticulously shaped to maintain the appearance of a stable, autonomous self moving through a fixed, external universe. In Buddhist understanding, this is the great delusion. The illusion does not begin with the outer world. It begins with the belief that there is a you at the center of experience. At this very moment, it feels as though there is a single, coherent you behind your thoughts. Someone reading these words, thinking, deciding, experiencing. This inner self feels immediate, intimate, and unquestionable. Yet, under the lens of Buddhist inquiry, this apparent self dissolves into a continuous flow of mental and physical events. There is thought, but no enduring thinker. There is perception, but no permanent perceiver. Sensations arise, awareness functions, emotions pass, but there is no central entity orchestrating it all. What you call yourself resembles a river. It appears continuous, yet the water composing it is never the same from one moment to the next. This realization strikes at the heart of human motivation. Nearly everything you do is driven by the impulse to protect, enhance, or fulfill a self that, upon examination, does not actually exist. You strive for success, yet there is no lasting self to possess that achievement. You gather wealth and possessions to feel secure, though there is no fixed self to hold them. You chase pleasure and flee from pain, believing this will bring you happiness, but there is no enduring entity to claim it. Your ambitions, fears, and daily struggles all stem from a misunderstanding of what you are. You attempt to preserve a self that is impermanent, defend a self that is not truly threatened, and perfect a self that has no stable essence to begin with. The illusion does not stop with identity. It extends to the world around you. According to Buddhism, what you perceive as an external reality is not an independent, objective realm you merely observe. It is a mental projection, shaped, colored, and interpreted by the workings of your own mind. Every perception is filtered through layers of conditioning, desire, and habit. You never encounter reality as it is. You only experience reality as it appears through the prism of your past experiences, cultural background, sensory apparatus, and emotional state. That is why two people can witness the same event and perceive entirely different realities. They are not seeing the world as it is. They are seeing their interpretations of it. What you call the world is, in fact, the world as it manifests within your consciousness, sculpted by your memories, your expectations, and your particular moment in time. The mind continuously and effortlessly constructs our experience of reality, so smoothly that we rarely notice it's happening. In our everyday lives, we don't realize that our perceptions are actively shaped by mental processes operating beneath conscious awareness. By the time something reaches your attention, it has already been filtered, interpreted, and fitted into the belief systems you already hold. What you take to be an objective perception is, in fact, a reflection of your own inner expectations, fears, and desires projected onto the world around you. This is exactly why meditation plays such a vital role in Buddhist teachings. Only through cultivating extraordinary mindfulness and concentration can one begin to perceive, even fleetingly, how deeply mental fabrication influences every moment of experience. Recognizing this doesn't just shift how you think, it has profound implications for how you live. Suffering, in most cases, doesn't arise directly from events themselves, but from our reactions to them. Pain alone does not cause distress. It is the resistance to pain and the craving for pleasure that deepen our suffering. The turmoil is not simply in change, but in our desperate longing for things to remain constant in a reality where nothing endures. The source of our discontent is not merely the absence of what we want, but the illusion that gaining it will finally make us whole, when in truth, lasting peace cannot be found in external circumstances. All of this turmoil stems from a fundamental misunderstanding, the idea that we are distinct, permanent selves navigating a stable, external world, and that our happiness hinges on our ability to control it. Buddhism doesn't just point to this misconception. It offers a path toward freedom from it. Real liberation begins when you see through the illusion of being a fixed, autonomous self. You begin to understand that what you experience is not reality in itself, but a mental representation shaped by countless influences. This realization is not abstract or philosophical. It's a powerful, experiential shift that transforms your relationship with everything. When you no longer believe in a solid self that must be defended, the fear that drives so much of human behavior starts to dissolve. Grasping the impermanent nature of all things makes the act of clinging appear not only futile, but unnecessary. Seeing that both pleasure and pain arise from within, not from the external world, empowers you to stop feeling at the mercy of circumstances. Instead, you begin to take full responsibility for the quality of your inner life. But reaching this level of insight is no easy task. It requires a radical questioning of the very foundations upon which your sense of identity is built. You must examine not just your opinions about the world, but the deeply held belief that there is a separate you at the center of it all. You have to go beyond surface-level misunderstandings and confront the core illusion that there is someone who can be deceived in the first place. This is why awakening, in Buddhist terms, is often likened to a death followed by a rebirth. The person who begins the journey of awakening is fundamentally transformed by it, so much so that in the end they are scarcely the same person at all. True insight dismantles every notion you've ever held about who you are and what the world is. For many, this degree of inner transformation is too unsettling to entertain. The ego is relentless in its effort to maintain its existence, even to the extent of co-opting spiritual wisdom and using it to reinforce its own importance. But the very mental processes that produce suffering cannot also be the ones to eliminate it, because the mind itself is the root of the illusion. This is why Buddhist disciplines prioritize direct experiential understanding over intellectual analysis and sustained, structured practice over momentary epiphanies. The illusion of a separate self is not a rational mistake that can be corrected by changing your thoughts. It is a deeply embedded pattern of perception, one that can only be dismantled through prolonged and intentional exploration of consciousness itself. Even then, total freedom from these deeply rooted illusions usually requires a lifetime or more of devoted, disciplined practice. Part 6. The Craft of Twisting Political Truths. On the evening of June 17, 1972, 5 individuals were caught breaking into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. Initially, the event seemed trivial, the kind of minor burglary that might earn a brief mention deep inside a newspaper. Yet, this seemingly insignificant incident ignited a political inferno that would ultimately force the resignation of the President of the United States. What followed was a remarkable exhibition of the human capacity to rationalize the indefensible. The Watergate scandal became a masterclass in how adept minds can distort reality so thoroughly that fiction masquerades as fact and misconduct is rebranded as duty. While Richard Nixon did not personally orchestrate the burglary, his response to the unfolding crisis exposed a deeper truth about the psychological strains that come with holding power. As connections between the break-in and Nixon's re-election campaign surfaced, the president stood at a crossroads. He could have chosen transparency and accountability. Instead, he pursued a course defined by denial, misdirection, and secrecy. Each individual decision might have seemed justifiable in the moment, each lie framed as a means to protect something ostensibly more important than honesty itself. These actions were not simply evasive. They were framed as essential, even virtuous. With every step deeper into concealment, Nixon and his allies wove a complex tapestry of distortions that ultimately defied unraveling. It's plausible that Nixon himself no longer recognized where genuine belief ended and self-deception began. His downfall was not driven by cold, calculated evil, but by a very human instinct to protect oneself, magnified to a national scale. It all began with careful rationalizations, the sort that might be presented as valid arguments in a graduate-level ethics class. Nixon convinced himself that defending the presidency outweighed admitting to what, at first, appeared to be a relatively minor political error. He reasoned that revealing certain truths would jeopardize national security or disrupt governmental stability. Gradually, he adopted the belief that he was the victim of a vindictive political assault. If his adversaries were willing to abandon the rules, why shouldn't he respond in kind? One justification followed another, building into a comprehensive internal logic in which the cover-up was not just excusable, it became a duty. In Nixon's eyes, he wasn't violating the law, he was performing the burdensome work of a leader under siege. He imagined himself as a stabilizing force, shielding the nation from political upheaval. The same psychological tools that allow individuals to rationalize everyday dishonesty, fudging a tax form, lying to protect someone's feelings, were now operating at the pinnacle of American power. As the investigation progressed, so did Nixon's justifications. When Congress demanded access to White House tapes that might confirm his role in the cover-up, he invoked executive privilege. Nixon argued that a president must have the freedom to speak candidly with his advisers without the threat of every conversation being scrutinized and weaponized. In theory, this was not an unreasonable stance, and Nixon may have genuinely believed he was defending the institution of the presidency rather than shielding himself from scandal. Yet, when the pressure intensified, he fired the special prosecutor overseeing the case. He also accepted the resignations of senior Justice Department officials who refused to support that decision. Once again, Nixon cloaked his actions in constitutional language, insisting he was upholding executive authority and maintaining governmental order. At each juncture, he cast himself not as a wrongdoer, but as a protector of the nation's governing structures. This storyline proved powerful, not just to Nixon, but to a significant portion of the public. Many supporters began to see him not as a corrupt leader, but as the victim of partisan aggression. The most emblematic moment came when Nixon declared, "I am not a crook." By that time, his presidency was unraveling. Investigations had uncovered extensive abuses of power, and even his loyal allies were beginning to withdraw their support. Yet Nixon seemed utterly sincere. To him, the label crook implied selfish criminality, and he had long convinced himself that his actions were committed in service of a noble goal. In his view, he had been defending national security, preserving the constitutional framework, and shielding the presidency from those who sought to tear it down. Within the narrative he had constructed, the lies, the obstruction, the misuse of executive authority, none of these were crimes. They were the unfortunate but necessary costs of protecting a higher cause. This is the disturbing power of moral rationalization, the ability to turn wrongdoing into virtue in one's own eyes. Justification has the capacity to recast any villain as the hero of their own story. A striking example of collective rationalization can be seen in the public response to Richard Nixon during the Watergate scandal. At the beginning of his second term, Nixon stood on firm political ground, bolstered by diplomatic accomplishments and a decisive re-election victory. His approval rating soared to 68%, signaling robust national support. Yet, as the details of Watergate began to emerge, his popularity slowly declined, though not as steeply as one might assume. Even after months of damning evidence and persuasive witness accounts, nearly one-third of Americans continued to support him. Importantly, this loyalty did not stem from a belief in his innocence. In truth, many of these supporters privately acknowledged that Nixon had likely violated the law. Still, they held on to their allegiance by constructing elaborate justifications. Some minimized the scandal by asserting that corruption was a common trait among politicians, suggesting Nixon's conduct was no worse than anyone else's. Others emphasized his foreign policy accomplishments, arguing these outweighed his domestic failings. A portion feared that removing a sitting president would do more damage to the country than allowing a compromised leader to remain in power. In some circles, the blame was redirected entirely, accusing the investigation, rather than Nixon's actions, of undermining democracy. Unlike personal rationalization, political justification is deeply intertwined with group identity and partisan loyalty. Support for Nixon evolved beyond the individual. It became an act of allegiance to a broader political identity, one anchored in party lines, ideological beliefs, and deeply held values. To admit Nixon's wrongdoing was to confront a more unsettling possibility: that their trust had been misplaced, that their political allies had failed, and that their core worldview might require re-examination. For many, it was less painful to rationalize Nixon's behavior than to grapple with the emotional and intellectual upheaval of questioning their foundational assumptions. In defending Nixon, they weren't just protecting a political figure. They were protecting their own sense of self and political belonging. This dynamic helps explain why political scandals often intensify partisan divides rather than heal them. The stronger the evidence, the more impassioned and complex the defenses become. As individuals commit to their original loyalties, the pursuit of truth is eclipsed by the imperative of group cohesion. In such moments, facts are stripped of neutrality and weaponized in ideological battles, where winning becomes more important than being truthful. Watergate exemplifies how collective justification can create a shared illusion that even ensnares principled, intelligent individuals. Nixon's closest advisors, many of whom once held strong ethical convictions, became entangled in a web of deceit. They persuaded themselves they were safeguarding a higher good, defending the presidency, ensuring national stability, preserving institutional integrity. Each individual's rationalizations supported the next, creating a closed-loop system where dissent was equated with disloyalty and honesty came to be seen as betrayal. The White House became a chamber of groupthink, where truth was no longer defined by objective reality, but by whatever narrative the group needed to sustain itself. Loyalty was measured by one's ability to uphold the collective illusion. This is how morally decent people end up justifying indefensible actions, not through one dramatic ethical collapse, but via a gradual descent into compromises that become harder to justify with each step. The deeper tragedy of Watergate wasn't simply Nixon's resignation, it was that the crisis could have been averted altogether. The original offense, a politically motivated break-in, and the subsequent attempt to cover it up, was relatively small in scale. A straightforward admission early on might have spared both Nixon and the country a great deal of turmoil. But once the cycle of justification began, it developed its own momentum, difficult, if not impossible, to slow down. Every falsehood demanded another to support it. Every rationalization needed reinforcement to maintain the illusion. The further one traveled down the path of deception, the more treacherous it became to return to the truth. As the stakes of coming clean grew higher, Nixon found himself caught in a trap of his own making. He couldn't disavow the lies without bringing down the elaborate structure of rationalizations that had been built around them. Ultimately, he chose to surrender the presidency rather than confront the full weight of his self-deception. This is where unchecked justification leads, not just to the distortion of truth, but to the complete replacement of reality with a carefully constructed delusion designed to protect the ego from the pain of being wrong. Part 7. Prophets of Delusion. Amid the social unrest and cultural upheaval of 1960s California, an obscure musician named Charles Manson gathered around him a group of young disciples. Under his influence, they would commit some of the most infamous and brutal killings in American history. Thousands of miles away, deep within the dense jungles of Guyana, a charismatic preacher named Jim Jones persuaded more than 900 of his loyal followers to end their lives in what he framed as a radical political protest. In rural Texas, David Koresh, another self-declared prophet, built an isolated community that ultimately ended in tragedy, following a deadly confrontation with federal agents investigating claims of child abuse and the illegal stockpiling of weapons. These narratives are often dismissed as the actions of madmen or sinister geniuses. Yet beneath the surface lies a far more disturbing reality. These are the outcomes of unchecked human rationalization, unbound by external scrutiny or internal hesitation. Contrary to popular belief, cult leaders are not mystical figures endowed with supernatural charm. They are skilled practitioners of psychological manipulation, adept at exploiting universally human cognitive patterns. These individuals construct intricate and persuasive narratives that offer meaning, direction, and certainty. Their mastery lies in their ability to make even logical, educated people abandon critical reasoning, surrender autonomy, and sometimes give up their lives. It often begins with what psychologists refer to as love bombing, a deliberate showering of attention, praise, and affection that makes the target feel exceptional, understood, and chosen. But this display of warmth is not genuine altruism. It is a calculated tactic designed to breed emotional dependence. People are most susceptible to such tactics during periods of vulnerability, following loss, major life changes, or emotional disconnection. In these moments, cults present themselves as a perfect remedy, offering clarity, belonging, and unconditional support. However, that unconditional support always comes at a price, one that only becomes evident once the person is emotionally invested. The warmth is real, but it hinges on conformity. The sense of community is genuine, but only if the individual begins to suppress the qualities that make them unique. The love, while deeply felt, is always conditional. What cult leaders understand, often instinctively, is that in a chaotic and uncertain world, people long for clarity. They offer straightforward answers to complex dilemmas, stark moral divisions in times of confusion, and unwavering certainty in the face of ambiguity. Whether their authority is claimed through divine insight, scientific revelation, or spiritual awakening, it places them beyond question, set apart from ordinary human understanding. In these systems, to question the leader isn't merely to disagree, it is to betray the cause. Doubt is framed as moral weakness. Critique is dismissed as ignorance. Skepticism is rebranded as spiritual failure. What makes cultic control so effective is that it transforms independent thinking into a source of guilt and fear, rather than strength or insight. Gradually, members are trained to distrust their own instincts, emotions, and observations, replacing them with the interpretations offered by the leader. If facts appear to contradict the group's teachings, it's not the belief that falters, it is reality itself that must be flawed. When personal experiences don't align with the doctrine, they are explained away as ego-driven, sinful, or externally manipulated. This creates a self-sealing belief system in which no evidence can ever refute the leader's claims. Every doubt becomes proof of moral failing or external attack. Ironically, the more extreme and irrational the leader's claims become, the more they are taken as evidence of supernatural wisdom. Ordinary people, it is reasoned, would never make such audacious pronouncements. Therefore, the speaker must be extraordinary. In this upside-down logic, delusion is reinterpreted as enlightenment, and clear absurdities are viewed as profound truths. Maintaining this illusion requires isolation. Members are slowly and deliberately cut off from family, friends, and any sources of information that might provoke doubt or offer alternative views. This separation is rationalized as necessary, whether for spiritual refinement, ideological purity, or safety from a corrupt world. The outside is painted as dangerous, deceitful, or morally bankrupt, while the group is elevated as the sole sanctuary of truth, security, and redemption. Members are slowly conditioned to reinterpret external criticism not as sincere concern, but as evidence of persecution. They come to believe that such hostility confirms their group possesses a rare and profound truth that the world is either unprepared for or unwilling to accept. With each instance of rejection from outsiders, their conviction strengthens, reinforcing the idea that they are guardians of something exceptional and misunderstood. As the organization's expectations grow more demanding, so too do the complex justifications for staying committed. Initially, what's asked of members appears relatively minor, perhaps small donations, regular attendance, or distancing from negative people. These early commitments are often wrapped in positive language, framed as steps toward personal enlightenment or spiritual growth. At this stage, everything feels constructive and harmless. Yet these first asks are merely the foundation. Gradually, the requirements intensify. Larger financial contributions, increasing time obligations, tighter control over social interactions, and unwavering obedience. Each new demand is portrayed as a natural extension of what has already been given. These growing sacrifices are rationalized through references to past decisions, noble missions, or supposedly urgent, exceptional circumstances. The more emotionally, socially, or financially invested someone becomes, the more difficult it is to admit those investments may have been misdirected. This is where the sunk cost fallacy takes hold, not just in monetary terms, but in one's entire sense of self. The more someone gives to a false system, the more fiercely they cling to its validity, unable to face the emotional cost of being wrong. Eventually, individuals may engage in behavior they would have once condemned, but by then their internal moral compass has been so thoroughly reshaped that those same actions feel justified, even virtuous. One of the most unsettling parts of this evolution is how deeply members learn to normalize what they once found unthinkable by altering their moral framework and sense of time. Pain and sacrifice are reframed as necessary stages on the path to awakening. Denying oneself becomes a badge of spiritual courage, a personal offering for the greater good. Acts that cause harm are defended as essential steps in achieving higher, sacred objectives, goals outsiders could never hope to understand. Members no longer see themselves as doing harm, but as playing heroic roles in a spiritual war where conventional morality no longer applies. They believe they are not inflicting suffering, but offering salvation. They're not exploiting others for money. They're redistributing resources for a divine mission. They're not deserting loved ones. They're choosing a more enlightened and transcendent form of love. The more extreme the obligations become, the more elevated members feel, proud to endure what others could not. This is where rationalization becomes most dangerous, when ethics are rewritten so thoroughly that vice is mistaken for virtue. What makes the experience of cult membership especially tragic is that it's often not forced, it's chosen. People willingly step into these systems because they fulfill deep emotional needs that, over time, become more compelling than truth or independence. Many ex-members describe their time in the group as the most profound period of their lives, marked by connection, clarity, and purpose they haven't felt since. What outsiders might see as loss of freedom, members often experience as liberation, the end of uncertainty and the burden of choice. Letting go of critical thinking feels like freedom from the exhausting ambiguity of modern life. Distance from the outside world isn't exile in their eyes, but a shield against corruption, distraction, and moral collapse. These individuals are not merely deceived by others. They are entangled in their own unmet psychological needs and in the narratives they build to meet them. Understanding how cult psychology works is essential because these same psychological patterns exist in more subtle forms all around us. Some workplaces are ruled by charismatic leaders who demand unwavering loyalty. Friend groups may enforce unwritten rules about what can be questioned. Ideological communities often punish dissent, labeling it ignorance or betrayal. The crucial difference between cultic behavior and everyday social dynamics isn't the presence of rationalizations, but how rigidly those justifications are defended against reality. When no outside evidence is allowed to challenge the group's inner worldview, that's when cult-like thinking emerges. Once this mindset takes root, it develops its own momentum, pulling people far beyond their original intentions. The road to extremism rarely begins with grand gestures, but with small, seemingly reasonable compromises. Each step, justified in isolation, quietly sets the stage for the next. In time, the ability to think freely dissolves, not through coercion, but through the slow, steady erosion of doubt. Part 8. Corporate Theater. Amid the gleaming towers of downtown Houston, Enron's leadership sincerely believed they were at the forefront of a revolution in the energy industry, pioneering a new model that would unlock prosperity for countless shareholders. At Wells Fargo, managers were convinced their aggressive sales tactics genuinely benefited clients by expanding access to critical financial products. Over at Arthur Andersen, senior partners justified their creative accounting techniques as strategic innovations, giving clients a competitive edge in an increasingly unforgiving business climate. These were not sinister conspiracies conceived in backroom secrecy by cartoonish villains. They were sprawling, deeply embedded systems of collective delusion, organizational frameworks that empowered thousands of highly capable, well-educated professionals to engage in deceit, while continuing to see themselves as ethical stewards of capitalism. The real danger in these scandals lay not in individual lapses of judgment, but in how rationalization became institutionalized, woven into company cultures in ways that made misconduct seem not only permissible, but even virtuous. Enron's meteoric ascent was founded on a genuinely novel and viable concept, a business built around the trading of energy derivatives. This approach provided energy producers with tools to manage price volatility and allowed Enron to profit through facilitating such trades. At its inception, the company offered a service that held real value in the marketplace. However, as the environment grew more competitive and profit margins shrank, leadership began pushing the boundaries of legality, adopting accounting practices that first skirted and eventually defied regulatory standards. Every new method adopted seemed, in isolation, like a logical step forward, an extension of Enron's trademark ingenuity. Each departure from traditional financial practices was rationalized by pointing to the company's trailblazing role in a rapidly evolving sector. What began as innovation was soon cloaked in layers of self-congratulatory logic, framing questionable decisions as visionary strategy. Senior executives came to see themselves as pioneers, redefining how corporate value should be created and measured. As misrepresentation became central to Enron's business model, the justifications became increasingly convoluted, further distancing internal narratives from operational reality. One of the most infamous tactics involved the use of special purpose entities, SPEs, which allowed Enron to conceal debt and present an inflated picture of profitability. These structures weren't marketed as evasive accounting tricks, but as advanced financial instruments, supposedly offering a clearer depiction of Enron's complex contractual arrangements. When auditors began raising concerns, Enron's top brass insisted that conventional accounting methods were outdated and incapable of capturing the sophistication of their financial architecture. To them, they weren't hiding liabilities. They were offering what they believed to be a more accurate portrayal of the underlying economics of their business. That these maneuvers dramatically exaggerated the company's earnings wasn't seen internally as a red flag, but as validation that they were outpacing an antiquated system. As the demand to maintain the illusion of perpetual growth intensified, the rationalizations grew more elaborate and more detached from actual performance. A key turning point came when Enron began applying mark-to-market accounting, which allowed them to record the anticipated profits from long-term contracts as if the revenue had already been realized. This gave executives enormous flexibility in projecting future earnings. When these ventures failed to meet expectations, losses weren't disclosed. Instead, expenditures were reclassified as assets, based on the logic that as long as a project hadn't been formally canceled, its potential value still existed on paper. Rather than shutting down struggling units, Enron merely shuffled them around. Staff were reassigned and instructed to maintain the appearance of vibrant operations, particularly during visits from analysts. These deceptions weren't viewed as fabrications, but as temporary measures, short-term tactics intended to sustain investor confidence until performance aligned with the company's bullish projections. Executives did not perceive themselves as falsifying the company's success. In their view, they were skillfully managing perception, protecting what they believed to be a fundamentally healthy business from the volatility of public sentiment. This entire framework of self-justification was fueled by an intense, outcome-obsessed culture that prized results above all else. Inside Enron, employees operated under a brutal forced ranking system that demanded constant overachievement, regardless of whether the market or the business itself could realistically sustain it. Critics who raised concerns about the integrity of accounting practices were often dismissed as lacking vision, resisting progress, or failing to grasp the dynamics of modern business. In this environment, success came to be defined not by genuine financial health or ethical operations, but by soaring stock prices and reported earnings. This mindset fueled a feedback loop in which questionable tactics were validated by the illusion of success they appeared to generate. Paradoxically, that illusion of success was created by the very practices it was used to justify. The company's climbing stock price was heralded as proof that its innovative financial strategies were working, even though those gains were based on manipulated financial disclosures that obscured the company's actual fiscal condition. In a separate but equally illustrative example, the Wells Fargo fake account scandal revealed another form of widespread organizational self-deception. Bank leadership persuaded themselves that aggressive sales targets aligned with their commitment to providing complete financial solutions. Employees were pressured to open multiple accounts for each customer and to push additional products, regardless of whether clients showed interest or had any need. When staff voiced concerns about the unattainable nature of these goals and the potential for customer harm, management insisted that the objectives reflected the bank's dedication to comprehensive service. Redundant account openings were rebranded as efforts to deepen customer relationships. Offering unsolicited services was reframed as a way to inform clients of financial opportunities they might otherwise overlook. As expectations intensified, some workers resorted to unethical practices, creating fake accounts, fabricating emails, and forging signatures to meet their targets. These actions were internally justified as temporary measures to protect jobs and maintain performance until real customer engagement could be achieved. Managers who became aware of these behaviors frequently ignored them. Hitting regional performance benchmarks and safeguarding their own career advancement was deemed more important than addressing the root causes of misconduct. They rationalized their inaction by telling themselves that customers would eventually recognize the value of these accounts and convert them into legitimate ones. Complaints from customers about being charged for accounts they never requested were treated as minor administrative issues, easily corrected by customer service. Rather than confronting the systemic nature of the problem, leadership portrayed each case as an isolated error caused by an individual employee, thus obscuring the larger ethical breakdown driven by flawed incentives. What made these scandals particularly troubling was how they thrived within a collective delusion that effectively silenced individual conscience. Employees operated in cultures where ethical behavior was penalized and unethical actions were rewarded. But the wrongdoing was cloaked in euphemisms and institutional justifications. At Enron, fraud was celebrated as financial creativity. At Wells Fargo, deceit was framed as client service. At Arthur Andersen, negligence was spun as loyalty to clients. These were not merely stories of a few unethical individuals corrupting otherwise sound institutions. Rather, they revealed how entire organizational cultures could manipulate the values of decent people, convincing them that unethical conduct was not just allowed, but expected and even admirable. The consequences of this kind of corporate rationalization extend far beyond individual scandals or firms. When the pursuit of short-term profits becomes the dominant goal and quarterly performance eclipses long-term resilience, entire industries are at risk of falling into cycles of justification that normalize increasingly irresponsible behavior. Banks defend predatory lending under the pretense of expanding financial access to marginalized populations. Pharmaceutical companies explain away exorbitant drug prices by citing research and development costs, even while spending more on marketing than on innovation. Technology firms excuse invasive data collection by highlighting the convenience and personalization it offers users. In each of these examples, a legitimate business objective is twisted into a defense for actions that overwhelmingly serve corporate interests while undermining the broader public good. The deeper tragedy of this rationalization is not just the loss of trust in a few organizations. It corrodes entire industries and distorts society's understanding of ethical corporate behavior and responsibility. When conformity becomes the default, choosing to dissent can seem not only pointless, but irrational. In an environment where regulatory agencies mirror the perspectives of the industries they're meant to supervise, and elected officials depend on corporate donations to remain viable, genuine external accountability fades into obscurity. News organizations increasingly prioritize financial metrics over moral responsibility, while consumers tend to favor low prices over ethically sourced goods. The structure of the market incentivizes behavior that aligns with profit rather than principles, reinforcing actions that should be questioned. The result is a systemic normalization of corporate misconduct, wrongdoing that is no longer seen as an anomaly, but as a standard operating condition, maintained by a complex network of mutual rationalizations spanning businesses, regulatory institutions, political systems, and industry alliances. In this framework, truth is no longer an objective ideal, but a flexible asset, tailored to meet the expectations of shareholders and quarterly profit margins. Reality becomes whatever sustains market optimism and boosts investor sentiment. The most insidious danger in such a system doesn't stem from those who lie with intent, but from the true believers, those convinced that maximizing profit inherently benefits society as a whole. Part 9. The Digital Echo Chamber. Bathed in the soft glow of our ever-present screens, we've discovered the perfect tool for self-justification. Social media, designed to capture attention and keep us engaged, has unintentionally become the most sophisticated system ever devised for reinforcing personal biases and sustaining comforting illusions. Every interaction, whether a like, share, or comment, trains the underlying algorithms to serve up more of what confirms our existing beliefs and less of what might challenge them. This goes far beyond political polarization or cultural fragmentation. It represents a deeper erosion of a shared sense of reality. We are no longer isolated in our self-deception. We are co-conspirators in a vast collective performance of mutual delusion. What may begin as innocent curiosity or interest quickly becomes a habitual search for validation. We gravitate toward articles that reflect our ideologies, follow voices that echo our values, and engage most with content that affirms what we already believe to be true. Each of these seemingly trivial actions feeds a constant stream of data into algorithmic engines whose only mission is to maximize user retention. These systems rapidly identify that affirming content keeps us engaged longer than material that introduces doubt or disagreement. As a result, they steadily narrow our exposure to conflicting perspectives, reinforcing a single, familiar narrative. This isn't the result of a sinister plot or deliberate manipulation. It's simply an effective and lucrative model. These platforms thrive on attention, and the most reliable way to secure it is by offering content that flatters our intelligence, confirms our values, and reinforces our sense of moral superiority. The psychological consequences, however, are deep and often invisible to the very people most affected. Over time, your social feed transforms into a distorted reflection of reality, amplifying views that match your own while quietly muting any that don't. The illusion takes hold. It seems as though nearly everyone around you shares your beliefs, values, and way of thinking. When opposing opinions do surface, they often appear in extreme or absurd forms, easy to ridicule, dismiss, or even hate. These exaggerated portrayals of dissent foster a false perception of unanimity and breed the assumption that anyone who disagrees must be uninformed, morally suspect, or irrational. Confidence in your beliefs grows, not because they are better supported, but because alternative views have been either silenced or reduced to caricatures. The tools of justification within this digital ecosystem are more advanced than anything previous generations encountered. When faced with information that challenges your perspective, you're not encouraged to think critically or form your own counterarguments. Instead, you're directed toward vast communities of like-minded individuals who have already done the cognitive work for you. With a few taps, you can access elaborate rebuttals, conspiracy narratives, and counterclaims, many cloaked in the appearance of legitimacy, complete with citations, expert opinions, and polished reasoning. The difficult task of grappling with uncomfortable truths has been outsourced to digital collectives fueled by motivated reasoning. You no longer need to defend your ideas alone. Thousands of others have assembled pre-packaged rationalizations for you to adopt and repeat. These crowd-sourced defenses create powerful echo chambers, turning small misunderstandings into sweeping distortions of reality. A policy disagreement becomes proof of systemic corruption. One flawed study becomes evidence that science itself is broken. A biased article turns into confirmation that all journalism is inherently deceptive. Each new layer of exaggeration builds on the last, often infused with heightened emotion and ideological spin. The most dramatic, emotionally charged interpretations tend to go viral, gaining the most shares and engagement. This, in turn, boosts their visibility and gives them a false sense of credibility. In this algorithm-driven environment, popularity often trumps truth. Emotional appeal displaces factual accuracy, and our shared reality is eroded in favor of narratives that feed the psychological desires of fragmented digital tribes. Digital platforms are intentionally structured to amplify content that provokes strong emotional responses. This design inherently favors the most extreme and oversimplified takes on complex subjects, ensuring their continued visibility and reach. The swift, far-reaching nature of online communication has fundamentally altered how people justify their views. In pre-digital times, individuals had the luxury of time to contemplate difficult ideas before offering a reaction. Disagreements usually played out in person, governed by social norms that promoted civility, patience, and an openness to understanding others. With limited access to echo chambers, people either had to reckon with opposing viewpoints or sidestep controversy altogether. Today, however, social media rewards quick, instinctive reactions to intricate issues, while endlessly supplying content that reaffirms any belief one holds. This constant pressure to respond immediately diminishes thoughtful analysis, and the flood of confirmatory material eliminates the need for self-questioning. Arguments that once demanded careful reasoning can now be reproduced in seconds through recycled talking points and viral one-liners. Consequently, while justifications for beliefs are more abundant and faster to generate, the depth and rigor of those justifications continue to erode. What's especially troubling is how these platforms have gamified the act of defending one's beliefs. Self-deception has not only become normalized, it is often rewarded. Sharing content that aligns with group ideologies signals allegiance and earns social approval. Challenging opposing views has morphed into a kind of theatrical performance, where the sharpest insult or wittiest comeback gains the most attention. Gathering supporting evidence has become a pastime, and each discovery of affirming data brings not just satisfaction, but a boost in social standing. Over time, the act of defending a belief overshadows the pursuit of truth, and emotional validation begins to replace intellectual honesty. As communities coalesce around common justifications rather than shared truths, they develop new social incentives that actively encourage deeper forms of self-deception. Those most skilled at reinforcing a group's narrative often gain influence, sometimes building entire careers around sustaining these collective illusions. This dynamic doesn't just lead to differing opinions about facts. It creates entirely divergent versions of reality. Each digital community constructs its own worldview, supported by its own experts, its own curated data, and its own internal logic. These groups aren't merely offering different perspectives on shared events. They exist within fundamentally separate realities, shaped by algorithmic curation and social feedback. A single political event might be celebrated as a triumph by one group and condemned as a disaster by another. A scientific study might be heralded as definitive proof by some and dismissed as propaganda by others. What one community sees as moral progress, another interprets as cultural decline. Each faction possesses elaborate, well-reasoned justifications for its stance, and equally detailed explanations for why the opposing views are invalid. Yet these justifications often rest on irreconcilable worldviews. The outcome is a digital ecosystem where the splintering of truth undermines democracy, social cohesion, and our ability to make collective decisions. When people cannot even agree on basic realities, be it economic conditions, scientific consensus, or major political developments, productive public discourse becomes unattainable. Without a common dedication to truth, even civil disagreement collapses, giving way to growing distrust and polarization. And when any opinion can be propped up by someone deemed an expert, the credibility of expertise itself begins to dissolve. In this fractured environment, knowledge becomes indistinguishable from personal belief. The very technologies designed to democratize access to information and empower individuals have instead fostered a world in which truth is measured by emotional resonance or identity alignment. In a landscape where justifications are instant and limitless, truth-seeking loses its value, and the costs of collective delusion are borne by society as a whole. We are no longer simply deceiving ourselves, we are building technologies that outperform us in the art of deception. And we continue to invest in these systems, not despite the comforting lies they deliver, but precisely because those lies feel better than facing the truth. Part 10. The Invisible Chains. After another exhausting 14-hour day in a job she can't stand, Sarah sits motionless in her car, convincing herself she has no choice but to stay. The weight of her mortgage, the looming cost of her children's education, and her aging parents' medical bills build an impenetrable wall of responsibility she believes she can't break through. Across town, Michael cracks open his fifth beer of the evening, telling himself he's earned it. He's spent the day juggling difficult clients and answering to an overcritical supervisor, and he sees this ritual as his only relief from the pressure. Jennifer spends her night fixated on her ex-husband's social media updates. She insists it's just a way to stay informed for the sake of their children, not admitting to herself that she's unable to let go. Meanwhile, David, who's already refinanced his home 3 times, convinces himself he's simply weathering a string of financial misfortunes. He refuses to see that his ongoing money troubles stem not from bad luck, but from a long pattern of overspending. These are not the kinds of dramatic implosions featured in tabloids. They're the quiet, everyday battles fought behind closed doors, struggles shaped by rationalizations that slowly harden into limitations. The harm caused by repeated self-deception doesn't make headlines. It reveals itself in missed chances, lost motivation, and lives diminished by stories we tell ourselves to stay comfortable. What makes these rationalizations so insidious is their camouflage. They present themselves as prudence, maturity, or responsible decision-making. Sarah claims she's prioritizing her family, putting her dreams aside for their benefit. Michael frames his drinking as a well-deserved reward after tough days. Jennifer interprets her fixation on her ex as vigilance, a sign of caring motherhood. David sees his refinancing and spending as financial strategy, a smart use of his resources to stay afloat during tough times. In each case, the destructive habits are cloaked in virtue. These explanations don't just sound reasonable, they often earn admiration instead of concern. So persuasive are these justifications that even those closest to them, friends, family, co-workers, often echo and reinforce them. Those caught in these invisible cages don't feel trapped. They feel noble. They feel wise. They feel unlucky. But beneath these tidy narratives lies a more difficult reality, an unwillingness to confront their own power to choose differently. Sarah genuinely believes that, given her circumstances, her current job is the only viable option. But the truth is, she hasn't earnestly pursued anything else in years. Exploring alternatives would mean acknowledging that she hasn't just been stuck. She's been choosing to remain where she is. Michael continues to view his drinking as essential, a solution rather than a problem. He avoids the deeper question: is the alcohol actually worsening the very anxiety he drinks to escape? Facing that would mean rethinking how he handles discomfort altogether. Jennifer clings to the belief that monitoring her ex is a form of responsible parenting. But the harder truth is that this habit heightens her anxiety and keeps her emotionally anchored to a past she refuses to release. Accepting that would require letting go of a false sense of control and stepping into unfamiliar territory. David attributes his financial mess to bad luck, sidestepping the fact that his habits, not external forces, are the real issue. He doesn't want to admit that his spending far exceeds his income, regardless of how much he makes. Over time, the consequences of these deceptions build, not through dramatic collapses, but through slow, steady decline. Sarah doesn't stall because she lacks skill or opportunity. She stalls because she's convinced herself that moving forward isn't possible. Her mindset stops her from seeking growth, expanding her network, or even recognizing when opportunities come her way. Michael's drinking escalates just as his stress and tolerance rise. But his rationalizations evolve in step, keeping the habit intact. What started as occasional relief becomes a daily requirement, and eventually, without fanfare, a quiet addiction. What he once saw as a coping tool transforms into a hidden dependency, masked as normalcy. Every stage of this pattern can be seen as a natural response to the pressures people face in real time. Take Jennifer, for example. Though her divorce is in the past, she remains emotionally anchored to it. This unresolved attachment ripples outward, affecting her children, straining her current relationships, and hindering her personal development. Yet, Jennifer interprets these outcomes not as setbacks, but as sacrifices, proof of her devotion to being a responsible parent. David, on the other hand, is watching his financial stability erode as mounting interest gradually consumes his income. Instead of tackling the root issue, his growing debt, he zeroes in on managing his monthly payments. He reassures himself that a forthcoming raise or a lucky break in an investment will fix everything. In both situations, these mental narratives offer short-term emotional relief, but over time, they create deeper consequences, outcomes so complex that they require even more elaborate rationalizations just to preserve a sense of personal coherence. What makes this truly tragic is that habitual self-justification slowly eats away at the very qualities needed to escape these harmful patterns. The more someone explains away their poor choices, the more proficient they become at doing just that, and the less capable they are of making thoughtful, constructive decisions. Problems aren't solved. They're simply reframed in ways that make them easier to ignore, which leads to a decline in the ability to actually resolve them. When people shift blame for their choices onto outside forces, they erode their own sense of agency. The refusal to confront uncomfortable truths stifles self-awareness and blocks the path to meaningful change. Justification, like a muscle, grows stronger the more it's used, eventually overpowering other essential mental faculties that go neglected. Those who rely heavily on rationalizing their behavior often feel trapped in their circumstances. Even when change is within reach, they perceive themselves as stuck. Gradually, their perspective becomes clouded by imagined limits. They see obstacles where there could be possibilities, threats where there might be growth, and confinement where freedom is still available. But the effects of self-justification don't end with the individual. Children raised in environments where self-deception is routine often absorb these patterns, setting the stage for generational cycles of avoidance and rationalization. Romantic partners may either reinforce these dysfunctional habits or end up in constant conflict over behaviors that are never acknowledged as problematic. Friends and colleagues become entangled in these dynamics, frequently forced to choose between honesty and loyalty. Workplaces begin to adapt around employees who justify underperformance, resulting in diluted standards and fading accountability. When enough people begin excusing persistent problems, entire communities may come to accept dysfunction as the norm, making meaningful reform seem futile or even suspect. The wider economic toll of this pattern is immense, though rarely named for what it is. Countless individuals remain stuck in roles that underuse their talents, having persuaded themselves they have no alternatives. Organizations stagnate or fail because leaders cling to familiar routines rather than confronting inconvenient truths. Entire sectors lose momentum when the culture becomes saturated with rationalization rather than innovation. In healthcare, preventable diseases overwhelm the system because people defend the behaviors that contribute to them rather than change course. In education, it becomes difficult to foster deep thinking in students who have been taught to prize emotional comfort over intellectual challenge. Courts fill up with disputes rooted in people's unwillingness to take ownership of their actions. Democracies falter when citizens cling to their political views out of loyalty or fear, rather than inspecting them with honesty and care. But perhaps the most profound cost of chronic self-justification is not structural. It's personal and existential. Those who devote their lives to defending their past choices instead of learning from them forfeit the opportunity to grow into their best selves. They remain confined to smaller, more limited versions of who they could be, less vibrant, less self-directed, and less fulfilled. For these individuals, life becomes a passive experience, something endured rather than actively shaped through conscious decisions and meaningful effort. Many individuals unknowingly condition themselves to feel helpless when confronted with their most pressing life challenges, remaining oblivious to the very opportunities that could lead to profound transformation. They mistake the justifications they offer for their current circumstances as reflections of their identity, and they accept the limits they've imposed on themselves as inherent truths. In trying to avoid the fear that comes with taking full responsibility and the discomfort that naturally accompanies meaningful growth, they settle into lives marked by diminished potential and forsaken dreams. Tragically, the very tactics they use to avoid pain become the root of their deepest suffering. The psychological defenses and emotional safeguards they construct to feel secure eventually harden into the walls of a prison of their own making. The most sorrowful part is that these walls are never as impenetrable as they appear, and the confinement they experience is far easier to break free from than they believe. Ultimately, what stands between most people and a significantly better life is the complex web of excuses they've created to convince themselves that change is either unattainable or not worth the effort. Liberation is always accessible, but it requires the bravery to release the comforting stories that make their self-imposed limitations feel bearable. Part 11. The Mirror of Self-Recognition. Recognizing when you're lying to yourself is one of the most difficult psychological feats. You can easily spot when a friend is making excuses, sense projection in a coworker's comment, or detect denial in a relative's behavior with uncanny precision. But turning that lens inward is a far trickier task, like performing a magic trick and trying to catch yourself in the act, even as you're the one performing it. This difficulty stems from the fact that the same mental faculties we use to evaluate our thoughts are also the ones that construct our rationalizations. It's akin to trying to see your own blind spot or bite your own teeth, an impossible paradox. The examiner and the subject are the same. The mind that judges is also the one being judged. And while it's not impossible to uncover these inner maneuvers, doing so requires an uncommon level of psychological courage that many people instinctively resist. The first gateway to authentic self-awareness lies in learning to detect the subtle physical and emotional signs that arise just before self-deception kicks in. Perhaps there's a mild tension in your chest before you excuse something you know is questionable. You may notice your voice quicken as you attempt to justify an action that quietly fills you with discomfort or guilt. A defensive tone might creep into your speech when someone questions a choice you haven't fully processed. Your body often registers the contradiction before your conscious mind admits it. By learning to tune into these subtle internal reactions, you can build a kind of early warning system for when you're starting to rationalize. But nurturing this level of self-awareness is a demanding process, one many instinctively avoid. Why is that? Because heightened self-awareness can dismantle the comforting stories we tell ourselves. The language we use to justify our actions, both privately and publicly, offers powerful insight into when we're bending the truth, especially to ourselves. Pay attention to expressions like, "I had no other option," "anyone else would have done the same," or "I was just being realistic." Such statements often reflect an effort to recast a personal decision as something inevitable, subtly turning yourself from the author of your actions into a passive recipient of circumstance. Be cautious with phrases like, "This isn't like me, but," or "It's just temporary, until," or "I only did it because." These qualifiers frequently precede elaborate justifications for choices that conflict with your core values or long-term priorities. Another revealing signal lies in the ratio between decision-making and justification. If you find yourself spending far more time defending a choice than you did making it, that's a strong indicator you're not just explaining it. You're trying to convince yourself it was the right call. Solid decisions typically don't require elaborate defenses, but perhaps the most revealing clue is your emotional response when someone questions your behavior. Do you immediately feel under attack? Do you shut down their perspective without truly considering it? Do you reflexively assume their motives are negative, that they must be selfish, uninformed, or out to get you? These reflexes often indicate that their words have pierced a layer of psychological armor, unsettling beliefs you've gone to great lengths to protect. People who feel confident in their decisions generally meet criticism with curiosity rather than hostility. They're willing to listen, reflect, and even entertain the possibility that they might be wrong. On the other hand, those holding tightly to fragile self-justifications often experience criticism as a personal affront. That discomfort isn't about the question itself. It's about what the question threatens to expose. These challenges can crack the mental scaffolding built to avoid uncomfortable truths about oneself. The stories you tell about your past can also shed light on the stories you're currently telling yourself. Are you frequently portrayed as a victim of forces outside your control? Do you emphasize external setbacks while minimizing your own choices or accountability? Do your memories cast your actions as inevitable, your missteps as reasonable, and your outcomes as products of circumstance rather than decision? The way you narrate your past often echoes the same justifications you rely on in the present. People who genuinely take responsibility for their lives tend to frame past failures as learning experiences and their successes as the product of deliberate action and persistence. In contrast, those who lean heavily on rationalizations often attribute their failures to bad luck or injustice, and view their achievements as reflections of innate superiority or moral virtue. No matter how earnestly you try to recount your life, some degree of fiction inevitably slips in. The choices you make in shaping your personal narrative, what you include, what you leave out, how you frame each event, often serve to protect the version of yourself you want to believe in today. These narrative adjustments aren't random. They usually reveal the mental strategies you've developed to maintain your current self-concept. One of the most effective ways to challenge these internal narratives isn't by tearing down opposing perspectives with weak counterarguments, but by doing the opposite, by building up the strongest possible version of the viewpoint you're resisting. This is known as steel manning, and it demands intellectual honesty and humility. When your ideas, values, or behaviors come under fire, the instinct is often to latch onto the most flawed aspects of the critique. But genuine self-examination begins when you take those criticisms seriously, especially the ones that make you uncomfortable. Ask yourself, what might the other person be noticing that I've failed to see? Even if their delivery is harsh or their intentions unclear, their feedback may still hold truth worth considering. This process can feel deeply unsettling because it requires you to dismantle the internal defenses that help you feel justified and safe. Yet, confronting this discomfort is often the only way to expose hidden aspects of yourself, things your mind has worked hard to conceal. The criticisms that most easily trigger your irritation or defensiveness are often the very ones that deserve your closest attention. Another powerful lens for introspection is the gap between your professed values and your actual behavior. Most people can readily list the ideals they believe in: honesty, kindness, integrity, responsibility. But consistently living by those values is far harder, especially when doing so demands sacrifice or inconvenience. The space between your stated beliefs and your daily actions is typically filled with intricate rationalizations, not only to excuse your choices, but to present them as thoughtful, even wise. Take the time to reflect honestly on what you claim to stand for. Then, compare those values against your recent behavior. Where you notice major discrepancies, you'll likely find a well-constructed narrative explaining why your particular circumstances justify the departure. The more elaborate and convincing that story sounds, the more likely it's shielding you from confronting an uncomfortable truth about yourself. This isn't necessarily a sign of moral failure, but it almost always points to a blind spot in your self-awareness. Another way to assess your inner landscape is by examining the people and content you regularly engage with. These act as a mirror, revealing how much challenge and disagreement you're willing to tolerate. Do the people in your life primarily echo your worldview and affirm your choices? Do you mostly consume information that aligns with your opinions, while dismissing or discrediting anything that questions them? Are you inclined to label uncomfortable facts as biased, while treating agreeable ones as objective truth? Those who are genuinely committed to growth and understanding actively seek out opposing views. They welcome relationships that push them to reconsider, and they engage with content that could potentially reshape their thinking. By contrast, those more invested in maintaining a coherent self-image tend to build echo chambers, environments designed to affirm their beliefs and insulate their justifications. The diversity of thought you're willing to engage with often reflects how open you truly are to having your rationalizations challenged. Perhaps the clearest window into your own patterns is this. Imagine someone else making the exact same decisions you've made. If a friend remained in an unfulfilling job for the same reasons you tell yourself, would you view their rationale as sound or see it as an excuse? If a colleague responded to adversity the way you did, would you respect their choices or silently question them? If a stranger mirrored your behavior exactly, would you consider their actions reasonable or problematic? This mental exercise can reveal the double standards that self-justification quietly upholds. Decisions that feel necessary or inevitable when you make them can seem avoidable or even misguided when done by someone else. Often, the critical perspective you apply to others shines a light on just how much slack you're cutting yourself through carefully hidden rationalizations. The truest measure of self-awareness is your willingness to change course the instant you realize you've been misleading yourself. Recognizing your own justifications means little unless you're prepared to face them and take action. Yet, for many, even when they catch themselves in the act of denial, they continue down the same path. Why is that? Because the alternative often feels daunting, too painful, too costly, or simply too unpredictable. Real psychological courage doesn't stop at identifying the narratives you've constructed. It demands that you dismantle them. It calls you to face the unsettling truth that some of your most deeply held convictions may be flawed, that changes you've long avoided are now unavoidable, and that the responsibilities you've dodged can no longer be ignored. It requires relinquishing the comfort of certainty, even when that certainty offers a sense of safety, in favor of the discomfort that comes with embracing the unknown. But in choosing this path, you trade the prison of illusion for the power of genuine, intentional decisions. The fundamental question becomes this: do you value truth more than ease? Is personal growth more important to you than clinging to what's familiar? Can you welcome possibility even when it threatens the stability you've come to rely on? How you answer will determine whether you stay trapped by your own excuses or rise to the challenge of seeing yourself with honesty and living in alignment with that truth. Part 12. The Collective Delusion. When an entire population begins to share the same flawed justifications, individual self-deception evolves into something more insidious, a widespread illusion that can persist for generations and even bring entire civilizations to ruin. History is filled with examples of cultures that convinced themselves that destructive actions were not only acceptable, but admirable and essential. In Nazi Germany, the mass murder of millions was portrayed as a necessary act of racial cleansing and national defense. In the antebellum American South, slavery was upheld as both an economic necessity and a divine right. Under the Soviet Union, forced starvation was depicted as a noble sacrifice required for revolutionary progress and the inevitable march of history. These were not merely cases of tyrants manipulating an unwilling populace. Ordinary individuals created elaborate moral systems that allowed them to see atrocities as reasonable, even righteous. The same psychological tools used to justify personal misdeeds were simply magnified on a societal scale, making them vastly more powerful and dangerous. As these collective justifications are reinforced by peers, family members, co-workers, religious figures, politicians, and the media, they begin to shed their identity as rationalizations. They come to resemble objective facts, basic assumptions about the world that feel so self-evident. They are no longer subject to doubt. When nearly everyone in a community embraces a common narrative, questioning it doesn't just seem radical, it can appear illogical or even threatening. Social pressure and our innate desire to maintain internal consistency create self-sustaining belief systems that are exceptionally difficult to dismantle. Take, for example, how entire societies can convince themselves that their economic systems are just and efficient, even when these systems clearly benefit only a privileged minority, while consigning millions to poverty. The affluent class defends its position by portraying itself as the engine of innovation and prosperity, claiming that its wealth eventually lifts everyone. The middle class clings to the hope of upward mobility, trusting that hard work will one day elevate them into the ranks of the elite. Meanwhile, those struggling in poverty are often led to internalize their hardship as a personal failure, embracing narratives of self-discipline and individual responsibility. Each social tier is equipped with its own narrative that defends the status quo as not only permanent, but morally right. The wealthy argue that inequality drives progress through economic growth and innovation. The middle class finds meaning in ideals like meritocracy and the promise of the American dream, which transforms suffering into a stepping stone rather than a sign of systemic failure. For those at the bottom, the justifications often take religious or political forms, framing suffering as a path to spiritual growth or attributing blame to other marginalized groups instead of the structures that sustain inequality. These varied rationalizations intersect and reinforce one another, forming a shared lens through which injustice appears normal, and any effort to resist it is painted as naive or even subversive. Media outlets, frequently owned or influenced by the wealthy, tend to amplify stories of exceptional success and individual triumph, while ignoring or minimizing the structural barriers that limit opportunity for the many. Educational institutions often present economic theories that take the existing system as a given, dismissing alternative models as either obsolete or impractical. Political frameworks are typically built to serve those already in power, making it exceedingly hard for voices demanding change to gain legitimacy or influence. Religious organizations can also play a role in preserving the status quo, encouraging followers to interpret suffering as a divine test or a necessary burden that will be rewarded in the afterlife. Together, these forces create a deeply entrenched cultural narrative, one that not only makes extreme inequality appear natural, but casts it as a moral good or an unavoidable fact of life. Perhaps the most staggering and far-reaching example of this kind of shared delusion is humanity's ongoing destruction of the natural world. Although the scientific community overwhelmingly agrees that our current consumption habits are steering us toward environmental catastrophe, many in wealthy societies persist in lifestyles that harm the planet, often supported by elaborate rationalizations. People frequently defend their carbon-intensive behaviors by insisting their individual impact is too small to matter, or by placing faith in future technological innovations to solve the crisis before it becomes unmanageable. Businesses, for their part, justify environmentally damaging practices by pointing to consumer demand, compliance with existing laws, and a duty to deliver profits to shareholders. Governments similarly explain their limited climate action by arguing that robust economic growth is necessary to fund environmental initiatives, or that unilateral efforts would undermine their competitiveness on the global stage. These justifications, repeated at every level of society, form a dense network of excuses that enable nearly everyone to appear responsible while avoiding true accountability. Consumers shift the blame to companies for producing unsustainable goods. Companies point to consumers for driving demand. Developed nations accuse emerging economies of increasing emissions, while the latter highlight the historical pollution and overconsumption of industrialized countries. Current generations often criticize those in the past for creating the ecological mess, even as they resist making the sacrifices needed to protect future generations. The complexity of the crisis provides convenient cover, allowing each group to highlight others' failures while overlooking its own role in the problem. This is a classic example of a collective action dilemma. Actions that seem reasonable on an individual level accumulate into large-scale, disastrous consequences. What makes this pattern particularly dangerous is how individual justifications mask the broader irrationality of collective behavior. This is especially evident in today's political climate, where polarization has become a dominant mode of self-justification. Many now view those with opposing views not just as misguided, but as morally corrupt, dangerous, or mentally unwell. Each political camp constructs detailed narratives to explain why the other side's seemingly logical positions are actually dishonest, manipulative, or delusional. Any information that contradicts one's worldview is swiftly dismissed as biased or fake, while affirming data is embraced without critical examination, regardless of its credibility. This self-reinforcing cycle makes it harder for people to engage with valid points from outside their ideological circles, and more likely to see disagreement as evidence of malice. The result is the creation of two parallel social realities, each convinced the other is gravely mistaken, while remaining largely blind to its own distortions and inconsistencies. The rise of digital technology has intensified and accelerated this dynamic. Online platforms increasingly isolate users in ideological bubbles that echo and reinforce their existing beliefs, feeding them emotionally charged content designed to provoke and engage. Social media algorithms optimized for attention often promote content that triggers outrage or reinforces tribal identity, frequently by confirming biases and stoking animosity toward outsiders. Consequently, society now functions within fragmented digital ecosystems where groups are exposed to radically different interpretations of the same events and craft opposing narratives about their significance. These platforms have effectively mechanized the creation of rationalizations, churning out personalized stories that validate users' current beliefs and behaviors. The consequences of this collective rationalization are deeply troubling. When entire populations convince themselves that urgent problems are either exaggerated or already under control, despite overwhelming evidence, they lose the ability to adapt. Without the capacity for honest self-assessment and correction, societies don't just risk environmental ruin. They become vulnerable to any crisis that requires coordinated, rational action. Societies that succumb to widely held delusions often remain ensnared by them until external forces impose a reality so undeniable that the illusions collapse under their own weight. Yet, by the time this reckoning arrives, the damage may already be extensive, perhaps even irreversible. Moreover, the cost of transformation at such a late juncture is typically far greater than it would have been had the core problems been acknowledged and addressed earlier. The most perilous aspect of collective self-deception is its corrosive effect on the very institutions designed to enable course correction. When scientific organizations become politicized, their capacity to provide impartial, evidence-driven guidance on public matters is significantly weakened. In the same way, education loses its value when co-opted by ideology, eroding its ability to nurture critical thinking and intellectual honesty. A media landscape marked by polarization fails in its democratic obligation to deliver fair and factual reporting. And when the justice system is compromised, it ceases to serve as an unbiased and trustworthy arbiter of law and fairness. The weakening of any single institution increases the vulnerability of the entire system, as fewer independent and credible mechanisms remain to check abuses of power or correct systemic errors. Confronting widespread delusion is not a task that can rest solely on the shoulders of brave individuals. It requires institutions intentionally designed with incentives that promote truthfulness and penalize misinformation. This involves creating structures with built-in redundancy and overlapping responsibilities, ensuring that no single authority or interest group can control the flow of information unchallenged. It also entails implementing transparency measures that make the consequences of mass delusion visible to those most affected by them. Equally important is the development of accountability systems that tie authority directly to responsibility for results. Ultimately, this undertaking depends on fostering a culture that values truth over comfort, embraces intellectual humility rather than rigid certainty, and prioritizes long-term wisdom over short-term satisfaction. Such qualities are not innate. They must be deliberately instilled through education, institutional design, and cultural reinforcement. Without a proactive effort to confront our natural inclination toward convenient falsehoods, societies are destined to embrace comforting myths that may ease the present but ultimately undermine the future. Part 13. Truth or Comfort? The Ultimate Dilemma. At the heart of human behavior lies a profound tension, Our impulse to rationalize isn't merely a mental habit. It reflects a timeless, existential struggle. Is truth always worth pursuing? Or are there moments when comforting illusions better serve our well-being than the often harsh light of reality? This isn't an abstract thought experiment reserved for philosophers. It's a practical, persistent challenge woven into the fabric of everyday life. Day after day, we're faced with decisions that ask whether we will accept hard truths or seek refuge in more palatable alternatives. Do you acknowledge the growing signs that your relationship is falling apart, or reassure yourself it's just a rough patch? Are you willing to see that your career may have boxed in your potential, or do you prefer to believe that circumstances beyond your control have held you back? Can you confront the fact that your lifestyle isn't sustainable, or is it easier to trust that future innovations will spare you the need for change? These choices between accepting reality and embracing comforting distortions ripple far beyond the individual. They shape cultures, communities, and civilizations. And while truth is often held up as a noble ideal, the case for choosing comfort is more persuasive than truth seekers typically admit. Human beings are not impartial analysts built for data and logic alone. We are emotional, relational creatures wired for meaning, belonging, and hope, even if that sometimes requires bending the truth. Take, for example, someone grappling with a terminal illness. Clinging to hope, however unrealistic, may allow them to live more peacefully and meaningfully than surrendering to clinical statistics. A community under strain might sustain itself more effectively by celebrating stories of past strength and anticipated revival than by dwelling solely on present hardships. On a global scale, our species might find greater motivation to continue and adapt by minimizing existential threats rather than confronting them in all their terrifying magnitude. Research in psychology repeatedly shows that people with mildly optimistic views of themselves, their relationships, and their futures are generally happier, more resilient, and even more successful than those with strictly accurate self-perceptions. Emotional stability often stems not from razor-sharp realism, but from interpretations of reality that reinforce psychological strength and social cohesion. If we were to fully internalize the limits of human power, the cold indifference of the cosmos, and the certainty of death, we might find life psychologically overwhelming. Some degree of self-deception may be necessary, not just for individual mental health, but for collective survival. The more important question isn't whether we engage in rationalization or self-justification, but how much of it is adaptive and at what point it becomes destructive. A relentless pursuit of truth can be just as hazardous as complete surrender to comforting fiction. Yet over time, truth holds a firmer footing. Lies, no matter how well-meaning, eventually crash into the immovable wall of reality, and the consequences of that collision can be far worse than the discomfort that would have come from facing the truth in the first place. Someone who denies the reality of their terminal condition might forfeit the opportunity to heal relationships, find emotional closure, or prepare for the end with intention. A society clinging to economic delusions may overlook the reforms necessary to adapt and survive. A species unwilling to acknowledge its fragility may ignore existential risks until it's too late to respond. Reality does not yield to our preferences. The universe moves forward, indifferent to what we believe or how we feel. And while illusions may offer short-term comfort, they often erode the foundation required for personal growth, emotional maturity, and authentic human connection. Those who habitually choose illusion over truth risk growing distant from the real world and from the people who recognize that truth. To preserve their false beliefs, they may construct elaborate defenses that eventually isolate them. These defenses become barriers to genuine intimacy and honest dialogue, reducing relationships to shallow performances built on mutual pretense rather than shared reality. As the years pass, this detachment warps their judgment because it's grounded in misperception. Though they might achieve a surface-level contentment, they miss the deeper, lasting fulfillment that comes only from clarity, courage, and genuine engagement with the world as it truly is. The impact of valuing emotional comfort over factual truth carries serious implications for society. Democratic systems depend on citizens who can think independently, assess complex problems, and make informed choices. When many people prefer reassuring lies to difficult truths, whether related to economics, science, history, or social realities, the core mechanisms of democratic governance begin to erode. Market systems are similarly dependent on accurate, transparent information about costs, risks, and opportunities. When facts are distorted, whether through deliberate misinformation or self-deception, markets misallocate resources and economic efficiency falters. Scientific progress, likewise, requires researchers to be intellectually honest, to acknowledge when theories are flawed and revise them based on new evidence. But when scientific institutions are co-opted by political agendas or commercial pressures demanding preordained conclusions, the credibility of the entire knowledge-producing process suffers. Trust, the social glue that enables cooperation and shared purpose, rests on the belief that people generally speak the truth and uphold commitments. Rather than destabilizing him, his acceptance of life's impermanence became a powerful source of inner balance. Perhaps most importantly, the issue is rarely a binary choice between full honesty and complete denial. More often, it involves managing the internal conflict between emotional stability and factual awareness. Meeting this challenge calls for what could be described as measured honesty, the ability to engage with harsh truths in manageable doses, supported by emotional resilience and strong social ties. This approach means learning to distinguish between harmless illusions that help us cope and dangerous falsehoods that impair judgment. It involves cultivating the emotional maturity and relational depth required to seek truth, even when it disrupts our sense of security. People need hope, confidence, and a sense of self-worth to thrive. But they also need a clear grasp of reality to make sound decisions and respond to life's complexities. Developing this kind of nuanced honesty may be one of the most critical aspects of psychological growth. Children naturally rely on wishful thinking and self-protective beliefs to deal with feelings of dependence and vulnerability. Growing up means gradually learning to face uncomfortable and complicated truths about ourselves and the world without losing motivation or hope. This journey doesn't end in adulthood. Each life stage brings fresh emotional and existential challenges. Elderly people facing their own mortality, middle-aged individuals grappling with unrealized ambitions, and young adults coming to terms with their limitations all encounter key moments when they must choose between confronting reality or retreating. into illusion. Their ability to make constructive choices often hinges on whether they can find meaning and direction through honest self-understanding instead of clinging to comforting myths. In the end, the core challenge may not be choosing between truth and comfort, but rather determining how we relate to the beliefs we hold. Those who accept that their views are always partial and potentially mistaken are better equipped to revise them as they grow. Individuals who recognize that identity is something shaped rather than discovered can adapt. When doing so, fosters personal development. Similarly, people who acknowledge that their worldview is interpretive rather than absolute are more open to alternative perspectives and changing realities. This kind of intellectual humility makes room for what might be called deliberate self-deception, the intentional decision to emphasize certain truths while temporarily setting others aside, done with awareness of the reasons and potential consequences. When used wisely, this form of selective focus can maintain the motivational power of optimism without blinding us to reality. It allows for mental flexibility, enabling course corrections when necessary. Ultimately, the question isn't simply whether to prioritize truth or comfort, but whether we can cultivate the wisdom to know when each is needed and the courage to act accordingly. Striking this balance demands deep self-knowledge, psychological maturity, and the support of a healthy community, traits that are rare in individuals and even scarcer across entire societies. Yet, the alternative is stagnation, a life confined by unconscious rationalizations that prevent growth and reduce possibility. The decision between truth and comfort is, in essence, a decision between self-determination and self-deception, between living authentically and performing a role, between meaningful connection and collective illusion. In the final analysis, this choice defines what it means to live a full life in a world where the only certainty lies in the consequences of the choices we make. Part 14. The possibility of living authentically. After examining the numerous ways we mislead ourselves through avoidance of discomfort, the intricate defense mechanisms we construct, and the rationalizations we use to justify the unjustifiable, a profound question arises. Can humans ever truly live honestly, or are we inevitably bound to deceive ourselves in one form or another? Khayyam's poetic output also reflects this ongoing interplay between inner meditation and outer engagement. If authentic self-awareness is ultimately unreachable, then countless human pursuits, psychotherapy, education, and personal development among them, rest on uncertain ground. But if honest living is truly attainable, then it stands to reason that most people are living beneath their potential, bypassing the possibility for radical inner change. Our response to this dilemma determines whether we view human existence as fundamentally tragic or potentially redemptive. It shapes how we approach love, work, morality, and the deeper search for purpose. One prevailing, more skeptical stance, supported by extensive psychological research, suggests that self-deception is so ingrained in our mental architecture that complete honesty may not only be unattainable, but even harmful in certain contexts. Seen from this angle, the human mind did not evolve to deliver an accurate portrait of reality. Instead, it developed to maximize survival and reproductive success within the specific social environments of our evolutionary past. The very traits that once helped our ancestors flourish within small tribal groups now lead us to consistently misread ourselves and our surroundings. We are wired to see ourselves as better than we are, more moral, more capable, more intelligent, and more attractive. These illusions are not bugs in the system. They are features. They help us maintain confidence, build social bonds, and persist in the face of adversity. For many people, facing the full truth of human limitation, insignificance, and mortality would be psychologically unbearable. In this sense, a degree of self-deception might actually be vital. It serves as a buffer against despair, a lubricant for social cohesion, and a survival strategy for navigating an unpredictable world. Human life is fundamentally social, and our honesty often relies on the honesty of those around us. The problem is not merely personal. Authenticity within one person may be impossible if it leads to alienation from others, loss of livelihood, or separation from community. Social existence demands subtle compromises. Minor distortions and selective omissions help us get along with others and avoid constant conflict. Governments rely on simplified narratives to maintain political unity in the face of complex realities. Economic systems are sustained by collective optimism and widespread acceptance of often overlooked inequalities and structural truths. Even the relationships we hold most dear, romantic, familial, and platonic, are built on shared stories, mutual forgiveness, and implicit agreements to look past certain flaws. Absolute transparency, if pushed too far, could unravel the very trust and cohesion that allows society to function. In fact, striving for complete authenticity can sometimes lead individuals into profound isolation, the very opposite of the connection they seek. And yet, another viewpoint exists, one deeply rooted in philosophical, spiritual, and therapeutic traditions, that offers a more optimistic outlook. According to this perspective, human beings are not doomed to remain blind to themselves. With courage and discipline, they can achieve remarkable degrees of self-knowledge and genuine living. Buddhist practices, for example, have developed refined techniques for observing the mind without judgment, allowing thoughts, emotions, and bodily sensations to rise and pass without clinging to them. Psychoanalytic methods seek to uncover hidden drives and bring unconscious behaviors into the light of awareness. Existential philosophers argue for embracing full responsibility in a world that offers no inherent meaning, encouraging us to create purpose through authentic choice. Modern therapeutic approaches demonstrate that people can overcome entrenched patterns of self-sabotage and cultivate healthier, more compassionate relationships with others and with themselves. While each of these methods differs in style and origin, they all converge on a shared insight. Even if perfect self-objectivity remains elusive, profound progress in self-understanding and authentic expression is entirely within reach. What these varied traditions ultimately teach is that honesty should not be treated as a final destination, but as a continuing endeavor. Living authentically is not a fixed condition one arrives at, but a fluid, ever-deepening engagement with self-awareness. It's a lifelong unfolding, a process of inquiry, insight, and integration that moves us closer to truth, not in spite of our limitations, but because we confront them directly. Living authentically begins with the courage to face uncomfortable truths about yourself, gradually and with the right support in place. This journey requires environments that nurture personal development without overwhelming your emotional limits. Central to this path is the ability to manage your emotional responses so you can engage with discomfort rather than be overtaken by it or escape into denial or justification. Equally essential is surrounding yourself with people who recognize your full humanity and offer love without conditions. Such relationships provide the emotional safety needed to be vulnerable, which is the foundation of real connection. Ultimately, authenticity is rooted in discovering purpose and meaning through honest self-examination, not through illusions designed to soothe discomfort. Though this process follows recognizable stages, it's often unpredictable, non-linear, and marked by setbacks and repetition. The process often begins with a disruptive event or a deep sense of dissatisfaction that forces a reevaluation of your identity. This could be a breakup that highlights your role in recurring conflict, a career failure that shakes your self-concept, or a health scare that confronts you with your mortality. Whatever form it takes, this rupture makes long-standing patterns of self-deception unsustainable. Next comes the gathering of tools and support systems necessary for real introspection. This might involve entering therapy, beginning a meditation or mindfulness practice, having honest conversations with people you trust, or committing to self-reflective habits like journaling. These practices help you examine your internal world with greater objectivity and insight. The third stage is the emotional core of the journey, facing painful realities and weaving them into a clearer, more balanced self-understanding. This stage can be particularly challenging, as it often involves surrendering comforting falsehoods and accepting responsibility for things you once attributed to others or external circumstances. What follows is a shift in how you live. Your actions and decisions start to reflect your evolving self-awareness. You begin to make choices based on what is real, not on fantasy, defense mechanisms, or outdated narratives. The rewards of this shift are profound, though often unexpected. Authentic living may not bring immediate happiness, but it does offer a deeper sense of freedom, congruence, and personal efficacy. Those who gain a more honest view of themselves often describe a newfound inner calm, even when they must face parts of themselves they find difficult. Internal friction diminishes because the gap between self-image and actual behavior begins to close. As a result, relationships often grow more genuine and emotionally rich, as interactions are guided less by pretense and more by authenticity. Decision-making becomes clearer and more grounded, informed by a realistic view of your abilities, limitations, and context. Rather than being influenced by fear or idealized fantasies, your choices align with who you truly are. This clarity fosters resilience. Criticism and failure become easier to endure because your sense of self is not based on easily shattered illusions. Most importantly, this way of living opens the door to continual personal evolution, as you're no longer held hostage by rigid or outdated self-definitions. However, choosing an authentic path is not without serious challenges and losses. Greater self-honesty can uncover that some relationships were built on mutual avoidance of truth and may not withstand your new clarity. Certain careers or lifestyles that once felt aligned may turn out to be based on misunderstandings about your own desires, strengths, or values. You might uncover that dreams you chased for years weren't truly yours, but inherited from others' expectations or shaped by societal pressure. Realizing this often brings grief. Grief for illusions that must be released, for paths not taken, and for time spent pursuing goals that no longer resonate. There is a need to accept the reality that some problems have no solution, some limitations are enduring, and some aspirations will remain unrealized. For those who've leaned on idealized visions of life, such acceptance can feel devastating at first, even though it often leads to greater peace and insight over time. The road to authenticity frequently includes a period of deep disorientation, a time when old sources of meaning have dissolved and new ones have yet to take root. This existential limbo, often likened to a dark night of the soul, can feel isolating and confusing. On a social level, the impact of this inner transformation can also be significant. Those who reach deeper levels of self-knowledge often find themselves out of sync with cultural norms or group dynamics, which are frequently sustained by shared myths and silent agreements that authenticity disrupts. People may begin distancing themselves from conversations where they feel pressured to agree with viewpoints they don't truly align with, or from relationships that require them to perform a version of themselves rather than show up authentically. As they begin prioritizing honesty, they might find themselves at odds with groups that are uncomfortable with that level of transparency. This disconnection can feel disorienting, yet it often becomes a gateway to discovering communities and relationships grounded in shared values they hadn't previously recognized. These emerging connections typically revolve around a shared commitment to personal evolution, a genuine pursuit of truth, and a desire for meaningful human interaction. While navigating this shift can initially feel lonely or disconcerting, it frequently leads to deeper, more satisfying relationships than those they left behind. Ultimately, living authentically isn't just about telling the truth at all costs. It's about making deliberate, conscious choices aligned with self-awareness. Such intentionality involves recognizing how and when we engage in subtle self-deceptions. Rather than being unconsciously led by internal rationalizations, individuals can learn to observe these thought patterns in real time. This growing awareness empowers them to evaluate which beliefs and identities are serving their growth and which may need to be questioned or released. By cultivating this mindfulness, people can preserve the psychological benefits of focused attention and positive interpretation, while remaining flexible enough to keep evolving. It allows them to stay optimistic and driven without losing touch with reality. It nurtures authentic relationships while still respecting the unspoken agreements that make social life functional and compassionate. Most importantly, it reinforces a sense of agency and accountability, all while acknowledging the natural boundaries and limitations that come with being human. Authenticity doesn't mean expressing every truth at every moment. It means being acutely aware of when, how, and why we choose to hold back, whether from ourselves or from others. Part 15. Breaking the Spell. You've spent your entire life inside a framework so invisible and all-encompassing that it felt like the natural order of things. Like a fish unaware of the water it swims in, you've been immersed in belief systems so convincing and pervasive that they passed for truth itself. But now, the illusion has started to fracture. You've begun to recognize the machinery behind the facade. You've seen its fingerprints across disciplines: psychology, philosophy, politics, religion, business, cults, personal relationships, and societies as a whole. The illusion has been exposed. You can no longer claim ignorance. The spell that once kept you bound is unraveling, and with its collapse comes a formidable sense of liberation and an extraordinary horizon of possibility. The real dilemma isn't whether you'll continue to justify, because you will, but how you'll do it. Will your justifications arise from conscious, thoughtful intention, or will they emerge reactively, shaped by denial and self-protection? Your capacity to intentionally choose your illusions might be the closest thing to genuine freedom that humans can achieve. To begin dismantling automatic self-justification, you must accept a difficult truth. Every story you tell about your life, your identity, your motives, your worldview, is constructed, not discovered. These are not eternal truths waiting to be found. They are ongoing interpretations built to satisfy emotional and psychological needs in specific moments. This doesn't render your stories false or irrelevant. It simply means they are transient, flexible, and subject to revision. When you realize that you are the author of your own narrative, not its helpless protagonist, you reclaim the power to reshape the plot, recast the characters, and shift the direction entirely. You are no longer shackled to outdated scripts that no longer serve you. You are free to create new ones that reflect who you are becoming. This kind of deliberate authorship requires cultivating something called metacognitive awareness, the ability to step back and observe your own thinking in real time. It's the art of catching yourself mid-rationalization, of recognizing when you're displacing your internal struggles onto others, or when you're resisting an obvious truth. It involves tuning into the physical and emotional cues that often signal a deeper justification at play. That tightness in your chest before you make an excuse you don't fully believe. The defensiveness in your tone when someone questions a decision you haven't really examined. The overly complex rationales when a simple admission would suffice. Metacognition is like a mental muscle. It grows stronger with intentional use and weakens when neglected. As you strengthen this inner observer, new choices start to emerge. You gain the ability to select which thought patterns to follow and which to release. But don't underestimate the challenge. This is laborious, long-term work. These habits of justification have been carved into your mind over years, reinforced by social systems and environments that reward their use. Another essential tool in breaking free from these unconscious defenses is the development of intellectual humility. This means embracing the reality that your perspective, no matter how well considered, is shaped by the unique constraints of your experiences, your biology, your upbringing, and your culture. It's the willingness to admit that you might be wrong, even about beliefs you hold dear. It's remaining open to the idea that those who challenge your views might see something you've missed. Practicing intellectual humility doesn't mean giving up your beliefs or becoming indecisive. It means holding your convictions firmly enough to act on them, but lightly enough to revise them when confronted with better evidence. This is one of the hardest parts of breaking the spell of justification, releasing the comfort that certainty provides. Yet this release brings unmatched freedom. Once you stop defending fixed conclusions, You gain access to a far wider realm of inquiry, insight, and discovery. A space opens up in which real transformation and curiosity can flourish. Still, lasting honesty requires more than just personal resolve. It needs a foundation of trust. Many people cling to their justifications out of fear. Fear that looking inward will reveal flaws, inadequacies, or the suspicion that they are unworthy of love. To face these truths, people need relationships that offer clear sight and unconditional acceptance. When you are seen clearly by others and still embraced, it creates the safety needed for genuine self-examination. These relationships make it possible to explore your inner world without collapsing into shame. They provide the trust necessary to question your own stories and the courage to write entirely new ones. Authentic growth within relationships begins when we step beyond the safety of shared illusions. Instead of enabling each other's self-deceptions, the most profound connections arise from a mutual commitment to honesty and personal evolution. These relationships are rare precisely because they require both individuals to choose truth over comfort and transformation over predictability. Nonetheless, they are essential, especially since individual efforts to break free from the cycle of self-rationalization often falter when confronted with the weight of collective norms. The pull of social expectations and the instinct to conform to prevailing group narratives can quickly erode strides made toward genuine self-understanding. Those who succeed in cultivating truly honest relationships often find that, while the number of people in their lives may decrease, the quality and authenticity of their connections increase significantly. They shift away from superficial interactions built on roles and facades and instead nurture bonds rooted in sincerity and emotional depth. Central to this kind of transformation is developing the capacity to face discomfort and ambiguity with courage. Whether it's through meditation practices that teach you to observe difficult emotions without reacting to them, therapeutic work that guides you through unresolved pain without letting it define you, or physical training that strengthens your tolerance for stress, the specific method matters less than the underlying principle: cultivating inner resilience. It's about learning to remain present with emotional pain without defaulting to denial, rationalization, or blame. Most of our defenses exist to shield us from the distressing emotions tied to our identity, actions, or circumstances. But once you become capable of fully experiencing emotional discomfort without being overtaken by it, the psychological scaffolding of avoidance begins to crumble. This isn't a call to romanticize suffering or to seek adversity for its own sake. Rather, it's about developing the fortitude to confront the truths that surface about yourself, your relationships, and your life, without being undone by them. Ultimately, escaping the trap of self-justification involves grounding your sense of meaning in reality, rather than in illusions about who you are or what the world is supposed to be. Many avoid serious self-reflection because they fear it will empty their lives of direction or purpose. If you come to see that your career ambitions are more about earning validation than expressing genuine passion, what reason is left to strive? If you realize your spiritual beliefs are more cultural inheritance than divine insight, what anchors your morality? If you recognize that your romantic devotion is shaped as much by fantasy and projection as by authentic intimacy, How do you make sense of loyalty or sacrifice? These aren't questions with quick or comfortable answers, but they invite a deeper kind of exploration, one that seeks meaning beyond pleasing delusions. Walking this path can lead to what might be called existential authenticity, the ability to generate purpose from conscious intention rather than unconscious inheritance or conditioned reflex. This journey asks you to take full ownership, not only of your actions, but of the reasons you desire what you desire, not just of your decisions, but of the values that guide them, not merely of your beliefs, but of your entire orientation toward existence. It's the recognition that you can live a purposeful life even as you acknowledge its impermanence, uncertainty, and eventual end. You can choose to love others even while understanding that love itself is shaped by psychological patterns and evolutionary imperatives. You can commit to ethical action, even knowing that your sense of morality is rooted in cultural development rather than any absolute law. This conscious, values-based way of living may be the truest form of freedom, the ability to create meaning from within, guided by integrity and deliberate choice, rather than relying on external validation or comforting myths. And still, this process never reaches a final destination. Every new chapter, be it a gain, a loss, or a personal shift, will test the authenticity you've built, presenting fresh chances either to deepen your truth or to retreat into safety. The pursuit of an authentic life is not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing practice, continuous, evolving, and profoundly worthwhile. Significant life transitions, be they sudden losses, evolving social roles, or the gradual transformations brought by aging, continually test your sense of identity. These moments compel you to re-examine and redefine both your self-perception and your understanding of the world. The aim isn't to reach some final, unshakable truth about yourself. Rather, it's to nurture the habits, mindsets, and relationships that support ongoing personal evolution. In this context, authenticity isn't a destination you arrive at. It's a daily practice, a principle to live by, and a steady commitment to becoming rather than simply being. Perhaps the most surprising insight gained along this path is that our capacity for self-deception, so often seen as a flaw, can actually be one of our greatest assets when used with intention. The same mental flexibility that can rationalize destructive choices also gives us the ability to hold on to hope in the darkest times, to find meaning in grief, and to persevere when logic alone would tell us to surrender. The real task is learning how to steer this mental adaptability towards self-discovery and connection, instead of allowing it to keep us trapped in avoidance or disconnection. You possess the ability to center your attention on truths that elevate you, even while acknowledging that this focus is a choice. You can embrace a hopeful vision of the future without denying the unpredictability of life. You can be inspired by an ideal version of yourself, even while working with the person you are today. Escaping the grip of unconscious rationalizations doesn't require silencing your inner voice or abandoning your personal narrative. It calls for conscious awareness. The moment you recognize yourself as the author of your own stories, a deeper layer of self-understanding opens. You come to see that you have always been both the storyteller and the story, both the architect of illusion and the witness to it. And in seeing your role in your own limitations, you simultaneously uncover the ability to break free, Justification doesn't have to disappear. It can be transformed. What was once an automatic defense can become a purposeful tool. That same adaptability, which once concealed the truth, can now reveal your most honest expression. The essential question isn't whether you'll shape reality to meet your internal needs. You will. The real question is how. Will your choices enhance your humanity or diminish it? That decision is always within reach, and its consequences are always profound. At every moment, you can choose to be brave instead of comfortable, to grow instead of retreat, to be real instead of performative. These decisions don't just influence your inner life. They ripple outward into your relationships, your career, your community, and ultimately, the legacy you leave behind. Choosing mindful honesty over reflexive self-justification doesn't only liberate you, it contributes to a larger cultural shift. In a world clouded by denial and falsehood, every individual who chooses to live truthfully becomes a beacon for others still lost in illusion. The illusion can be pierced. The constraints can dissolve. The performance can come to a close. And what's left is the bold, challenging, and profoundly beautiful chance to live as your truest self, not the self you've presented to be accepted or to survive, but the one that has quietly endured beneath all those layers. The time for justification has passed. Now begins the more difficult and far more meaningful journey of living a deeply authentic life. His groundbreaking mathematical ideas advanced knowledge in regions unfamiliar with Persian literature. Simultaneously, his reflective poetry on mortality and meaning touched readers who knew nothing of his scientific endeavors.